A primer on Palestine. You've been lied to, misled, misinformed, poorly educated, if at all, on a host of topics, and this is one of them. How do I know? Because if you're seeing this, then you're probably a product of a school system, and if that system had even the slightest Western influence, then it's a safe bet that it, at best, didn't talk about most of this, or at worst, outright lied and propagandized you. First off, that's okay. It's not our fault that we were victims of a campaign that spans continents and costs billions of dollars to execute, but understand this most important point. It is our responsibility to resolve our ignorance. On October the 7th, 2023, a group of Palestinian resistance fighters aligned largely with and operating under the command structure of an organization we identify as Hamas attacked Israel. It was seen through the lens of Western outrage and ignorance, and unfortunately most didn't have the necessary context to understand what led up to those events, and were swept away by the mainstream rhetoric that would soon follow. This primer, this brief introduction to 3,500 plus years of history and events, hopes to serve as a launching off point, a guide to relatively understand some of the places, people, events, and actions that make up the totality of what we so glibly call the Palestinian-Israeli war, or even worse desensitization language, the conflict. What is Palestine? The first thing that we need to address outright is an attempt at memoricide of the Palestinian identity, culture, society, land, and people. In case you're wondering, memoricide is the destruction of the memory, the past of a targeted people, which can include traces of them, such as structures or cuisine, that can be used as a touchstone to remember a group by. For examples of this ongoing attempt, we'll circle back around, but first, a very brief history. Palestine is an ancient land, and especially for Americans, it's mind-bogglingly ancient. You need to understand that the people who have inhabited these lands have done so continuously for thousands of years. Gaza itself was mentioned by Thutmose III of Egypt in the 15th century BCE. That's 3,500 years of Gazan activity, a vibrant metropolitan port city. As far as Palestine itself goes, the Palestinian people find their etymological roots in the Greek Palestine, starting somewhere around the 5th century BCE. That stretches all the way into modernity with self-described Palestinians or Palestinian Arabs by Kalibadas in 1898. A land and people who saw the rise and fall of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Persians, Romans, Ottomans, and the British. They have been there since antiquity, watching, participating, being at the crossroads of civilization. They watched as the Crusades rolled through, literally creating the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were there to greet the Mongols and watched as Egypt reunified the lands, only to have it conquered once again by the Ottomans. This is a distinct set of peoples which had exposures to a staggeringly vast amount of cultures that have assimilated into something unique. They have their own foods, oral histories, dance, song, customs, clothing, and so much more. Palestinian identity is rich and abundant, with modern identity linked to the turn of the 20th century Renaissance, occurring towards the end of Ottoman rule, with poets and journalists and pioneering writers such as Ruhi Khalidi and Najib Nassar. New reformist governments came to be, tram lines were laid, gas lighting, sewage systems, the telegraph, steamships, modern roads, electricity. Education could be had in a variety of institutions, from state, private, and missionary schools. One could achieve a college education. So many cutting-edge things and so many plans for the future, though the outbreak of World War I would dampen these plans extensively. But it only goes to show Palestine is and has always been an active and integral part of the world. So why talk about this? Because it's a common talking point found in anti-Palestinian propaganda, and the media in the West especially, that Palestine isn't a real country or didn't really exist. As a streamer, it's a point I've encountered plenty over the years now. To try and be so reductionist about an area so unique as this, so dynamic as this, to simply attempt to apply a restrictive moniker such as country to it, and then shove it into that box of ignorant modern understanding, does a disservice to them, to us, and to history. Most of the history of our species is not able to conveniently apply the country logic to regions and peoples, yet we still recognize the people, the cultures, the regions. It seems that the Palestinians are the few that don't get this allowance for some reason. Wonder why. I promised to circle back around to an example of memoricide that's ongoing, and for that I have two words for you. Israeli hummus. What the actual fuck? Anyone familiar with the region and the culinary history immediately starts squawking with laughter at the mere mention of this. It's an absurdity, but more than that, it's a very easy reference point for how Israelis treat and use Palestinian culture. They co-opt it and attempt to erase the original. They do this with their settlement and location names all the time. It's even got a name for it. The Hebraization of Palestinian names, and they are prolific in their work. At least 2,780 historical locations, including 340 villages and towns, 1,000 ruins, 560 wadis and rivers, a wadi is a dry river bed, 380 springs, 198 mountains and hills, 50 caves, 28 castles and palaces, and 14 pools and lakes. This is an ongoing manifestation of settler colonialism and can be seen mirrored all across the world in colonized place names. See 26 of the 50 U.S. states names for examples of this. So, we have a distinct group of people who have continuously inhabited a region since antiquity that have their own culture, cities, and an organized society. Palestine exists. Palestinians have a right to exist, as all humans do, and they, like all people, have a right to self-determination and self-defense. Zionism. The big Z word. Feared the social media world over. Fun fact, as a Twitch streamer, I have to be particularly careful in the use of this word, as it could get me banned. It's been characterized as a slur, derogatory, anti-Semitic hate speech intended to harm Jews the world over lately. So let's unpack some of that, right? What is it? Where does it come from? Who does it come from? Why is it the way it is? Well, some of those are very big questions that call into question the very nature of humanity, but we'll do our best to unpack it as best we can. Here we go. Europe gonna Europe. I suppose we should start this story where all colonial settler stories start, in Europe. Zionism was an import from Europe, of course, but it found its start in the minds of 16th century evangelical pietic Protestants and 17th century Puritans of England. You see traces from Joseph Nazi encouraging Jewish settlement in Tiberias in 1564 and Francis Kett being burned alive in 1587 for stating that the Bible prophesied a return of the Jews to the region. In 1607, Thomas Brightman published his Revelation of Revelation, in which he wrote, "What, shall they return Jerusalem again? There's nothing more certain. The prophets do everywhere confirm it." It can easily be said that Zionism doesn't start with Jewish people, but starts with European Christians trying to get the Jews back to the magic place because their magic book demands it, really. The entire thing finds its origins in an ancient death cult obsessed with the end times. That's the harsh reality of this entire conflict when you get in close and look. These days it's all Muslims this and Jews that, but in truth, this entire thing was kicked off by weirdo European Christians obsessed with end times prophecies. Does that change eventually? Yes, of course, but not for a hot minute, that's for sure. In fact, the vast majority of the history of Zionism is written by non-Jewish Europeans obsessed with returning the Jewish diaspora to the Holy Land before it was known as Zionism, or if you wish to be more accurate, the Christian Zionist movement. It actually was more commonly referred to as the Restoration Movement. This is a movement that starts slowly but gains steam from the late 1500s all the way through to modern day and throughout it. It's largely focused around European advocates with more recent notable contributions coming in from the USA once that little project gets off the ground. The Protestants especially were big fans of this as they saw the return of Jews to Zion would fulfill God's promise to the Jews and act as a harbinger of the second coming of Christ. Effectively, they sought to force God's will. Nice little loophole y'all got there. But it's from this group of people that the idea of regarding Jews as members of a nation or race, instead of adherents of a faith, would come from. And oftentimes these believers held positions of importance in society. See William Blackstone in the USA and Lord Shaftesbury in Britain. This movement ebbs and flows, gains steam, and sees setbacks like most do. Along the way, there are points that evolve the idea forward. Attempts to lead a group of Jews back, it fails. The development of the idea of Jewish nationalism, the joining in by Anglicans, the investment in further attempts to establish Jewish settlements in the region, the founding of a variety of organizations intended to further the cause. Even so-called universities owe their entire existence to this. And in my opinion, a couple of the most important to note is the idea of redemption of the soil by Moses Hess, which would become the foundation of the labor Zionist movement, and Zvi Hirsch Kalischer's Derashat Zion, which contributes to creating the religious Zionism movement. But all of this brings us to the unavoidable topic in the room before we move on to the Jewish involvement in Zionism: the nature of European treatment of the Jewish diaspora and the subtle and not so subtle implications of this restoration movement. They wanted them gone, just maybe not that gone. So what was the motivation of these people? Was it for the good of their fellow humans who just so happened to be Jews? No, hate to be the bearer of bad news, folks, but it was blatant anti-Semitism and self-service. That's really about it. What's even worse, the Jewish Zionists knew this, used it to their advantage, and even, and sometimes still, engaged in it themselves to further the cynical cause. Now, that's a big claim, I know, but I'm prepared to back it up using the founder of what is seen as modern Zionism, trademark, Theodor Herzl's own words on the matter. Quote, "Anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies." That is Theodor Herzl, entry of June 12th, 1895, which you can find listed in the Complete Diaries of Theodor Herzl, Volume 1. So even the founder of modern Zionism was well aware of the motivations of those that would aid in this endeavor, acknowledging himself and making appeals to European leaders to resolve the Jewish question by sending Jews elsewhere. British supporters of the Balfour Declaration, this is a letter from 1917 that supports the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, used the Jewish financial conspiracy trope to attempt to get the US government to enter World War I even. After the Second World War, American congresspeople actually pleaded for Britain to open the gates to Palestine so the Jewish refugees, feared to be communists, would not contaminate the USA. This is just the smallest of slices of the degrees of anti-Semitism that were active throughout this entire movement and underpinning the motivations for the creation of the State of Israel at the expense of Palestine. But it speaks to the nature of the birth of the identity, in my opinion. It was started as a racist project to other a group of people in order to expel them from Europe at the expense of what they already saw as an othered people, and would do so using the tools they had at their disposal: colonialism. Amidst all this hatred is a cynical vein of thought coming from within the Jewish diaspora that sought to establish the settler colony by any means necessary, even the degradation and othering of their own people. See no further than Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the creator of revisionist Zionism's own words, in which he invokes the derogatory term of Yid, commonly associated with the Ashkenazi Jewish community. Quote, "Our starting point is to take the typical Yid of today and to imagine his diametrical opposite, because the Yid is ugly, sickly, and lacks decorum. We shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty. The Yid is trodden upon and easily frightened, and therefore the Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. The Yid is despised by all, and therefore the Hebrew ought to charm all. The Yid has accepted submission, and therefore the Hebrew ought to learn how to command. The Yid wants to conceal his identity from strangers, and therefore the Hebrew should look the world straight in the eye and declare, 'I am a Hebrew.'" Keep in mind, that same man would also gain fame for being the teacher and mentor of the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. It is historically and contemporarily a well-documented fact that oftentimes ardent supporters of Zionism, unfortunately, externally and internally alike, have strong currents of anti-Semitism running through them. Don't confuse the two. So long story short, there's two brands at work here, and I need you to not confuse the two. We have Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism. One is born of anti-Semitism, the othering of the killers of Christ, pogrom and pogrom, blood libel, the portrayal of Jews as a nation within a nation. The other came to be accepted outside of certain circles of weirdos after attempts to change society, in fact. The Jewish socialists organized, conducted revolutions, believing that overthrowing capitalist systems might be their key to freedom and liberation. Others still tried to fulfill the empty promises of liberal democracies to become equal citizens. But all of this was shattered by the Shoah, the Holocaust, in which over 6 million Jews were exterminated and so many spent years languishing in displaced persons camps, with no country willing to take in the refugees. European nations, America, everyone seemingly turning their backs upon them. Then Zionism began to make sense to them. Religious Zionism, aka a bunch of kooks. Let me introduce you to the teachings of a couple of well-respected Zionist rabbis, a father-son tag team duo with the extremely appropriate last name of Kook, one Rabbi Avraham Kook and his son Zvi Yehuda Hakohen Kook. Much of the racist fundamentalism that's taking hold once again in Israel finds its origins in Israeli elites following the teachings of these two men. Avraham Kook was the first rabbi to preach that the right of the Jewish people to Palestine is God's will, and that rabbis should do all they can to persuade Jews around the world to come and colonize Palestine. This, of course, runs contradictory to standard orthodoxy that Zionism is a secular attempt to undermine and circumvent God's will. And while Avraham is important, as he is the tree from whence the fruit falls, the seeds of that fruit bore out are really where it gets special. His son, Zvi, who took a more practical approach to his father's teachings and became the father to the Messianic Gush Emunim movement, which directly implemented the Judaization of the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip after the War of 1967. You can find some of the most extreme iterations of his ideological legacy in the Noir HaGevat movement. That would be the Youth of the Hills. This is the group that carries out attacks against Palestinian farmers, businesses, people, and holy sites. Why talk about this? It's important to note this uncomfortable truth, both to understand that to criticize Zionism is not an attack on the Jewish people first and foremost. In fact, it's an attempt to contextualize correctly their historical plight and to recognize that there are new generations of Israelis who have now grown up under a regime that has lied to them from day one, and due to their circumstances, many can't see their way to the truth. Thus is the nature of settler colonialism. Its victims start with indigenous populations, but span generations of people, including the generational beneficiaries of that colonialism. No one is immune to propaganda innately. The organizational entity takes advantage of everyone to one degree or another, and we have to recognize that the creation of the state of Israel is a crime in multiple ways and was inflicted upon many peoples. This isn't to absolve silence, participation, or active contribution to apartheid and genocide. We'll get there, promise. But to contextualize and attempt to understand how one could end up in a land foreign to your people as a conscript in a settler colonial army. That's all. I promise this essay is still about Palestine and the continuing apartheid and genocide. But again, context, baby, context. Bear with me. They didn't just suddenly take over, did they? The process of establishing control over the region was an insidious one, in fact, and started possibly innocent enough, but due to a confluence of forces and historical events, came to be what it is today, apartheid and genocide. The first settlers came to Jaffa in 1882, and like most colonial settlers, had no idea how to do much of anything, especially critical thinking, like farming. In fact, you'll love this. Most of them were former university students raised in Eastern European towns and had zero experience or knowledge in the field of agriculture. Certainly reminiscent of the Americas, isn't it? It was the Palestinian farmers, kind as they ever were to newcomers, as the region had always seen immigrants as a way of life. People come, they stay, they add. It was in this vein of acceptance that the farmers of the region took them under their wings and imparted the wisdom and knowledge of the soil, how to coax it to bear life. But a life as a farmer is not for everyone, and the leader of the group even, Israel Belkind, couldn't adapt and spent his life as a teacher moving place to place. We know that likely these Palestinians had no idea as to how these neophyte farmers viewed them, but they saved them nonetheless from likely starvation. What we do know for certain was how the Palestinians were portrayed in Zionist propaganda as aliens, appropriators of land that rightfully belonged to the Jewish people instead. Even as early as this first outlay of farm, they saw the endeavor as laying the groundwork for taking what they felt was theirs to take. By the end of the Ottoman control of the region in 1918, Jewish settlers accounted for an approximate 5 to 6% of the population. We're now going to speed run some events in rapid order. For this, we'll have to jump around the timeline a bit, but again, bear with me. Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jew, journalist, playwright, and founding father of modern Zionism, convenes the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897 to adopt a program to, quote, establish a home in Palestine for the Jewish people. They didn't state outright what would happen to the Palestinian population, but in his diaries in 1895, he stated his desire that, quote, the penniless population ought to be spirited away over the borders to neighboring countries. Genocide. Herzl anticipates that the Ottomans might be willing to sell Palestine if they got pressured by European nations. He even offered up funds, which he certainly didn't have, but the Ottomans told him to kick rocks. Herzl instead circles back to the British government and suggests that the new Jewish state could be somewhere else. How about Uganda? Uganda was controlled by the British. In 1903, the Zionist Congress meets and presents this plan, and the British government seemed to be receptive. In 1904, he's dead. Well, they buried him in Israel, even though he had only visited it once. 1905, Zionist Congress says no to Uganda. It's Palestine or nothing. You can then see from other Zionists, such as David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Ushishkin, that they couldn't care less if they got governmental approval or not. From their personal diaries, they made mention and dreamed of a Palestine devoid of Palestinians and openly discussed with others on how to achieve this goal. They, different from Herzl, sought to simply get boots on the ground, and both of them moved to the region and settled there. Next up was a guy by the name of Chaim Weizmann. He was the leader of the Zionist movement after Herzl went tits up. A Russian immigrant to Britain, he sought to create a powerful lobby in his adopted home of Britain as well as the USA, understanding that a strong lobby could help sell this idea of ignoring the existing Palestinians and establish a Jewish homeland instead. He sold this idea to the British as a means to create a buffer between the Ottoman Empire via a European colony in the Middle East. Seeing the collapse of the Ottoman Empire coming post-World War I, Weizmann maneuvered and manipulated the halls of power in Britain by building a strong pro-Zionist lobby comprised of a supervillain team of shitbags. Largely made up of Anglo-Jewish aristocracy who saw Palestine as a welcome dumping ground for Jewish communist troublemakers, outright anti-Semites who just wanted the Jews gone, and Christians who saw the return of God's chosen people to Palestine and a fulfillment of God's will. It took this team of Britain's worst people 2 whole years to persuade the government to manifest this fever dream. At the end of the day, it was of course economic interests that were the deciding factor. Ever heard of the Suez Canal? Yeah. They wanted a friendly government close by to help defend it, the empire's shipping lanes and all of that. On November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was made, stating that they would make Palestine a national home of the Jewish people while protecting the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. You know, the vast overwhelming majority of indigenous inhabitants. Fun fact, it's called the Balfour Declaration because it was actually a letter written by Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild. Even more fun fact, Arthur Balfour was Prime Minister of Britain in 1905 when he pushed for the Aliens Act that prevented Jews fleeing persecution from entering Britain. Can't imagine why he was in favor of this plan. Anyway, Britain, France, and the USA emerged victorious out of the First World War and start to carve up the Ottoman Empire. Enter the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN and founded for the exact same reason, to give an air of legitimacy to the global North supremacy and act as a cudgel against those that would cross them. This is where it gets bureaucratic and shady AF. I'll try and keep this brief, but it's a shit show of lib shit nonsense, really. So, the League of Nations established the mandatory system, in which a member state could be granted a mandate to govern a former colony or land belonging to a defeated empire. Know any recently defeated empires by any chance? Yeah. So, one of the few times in history that America is mostly right, Woodrow Wilson was an advocate for having, quote, an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development for the territories of the former Ottoman Empire. France and Britain, on the other hand, gimme land. By the end of 1918, historical Palestine was completely occupied by the British Empire and was firmly under British military rule. And in 1922, the League of Nations established Palestine as a British mandate, even though they had been de facto governing it for years at this point. This mandate included the Balfour language requiring the British to secure the establishment of a Jewish national home and to facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. The British, being rightfully world-renowned for their creativity and skill when engaging in colonial statesmanship, literally just did what they did in every other colony, hoping it would work. It didn't. They managed to appoint a high commissioner, one Herbert Samuel, but couldn't form a government. The Legislative Council was rejected by the Palestinian people, as acceptance was tied to accepting the Balfour Declaration, which they rightfully saw as colonial theft of their lands, as well as a rejection of the attempt to establish the Arab Agency, which amounted to an immigration authority for them, the majority, in their own land. With the utter failure in an attempt to establish a legislative government, instead, all powers, executive and legislative, became the purview of the High Commissioner. During the ensuing occupation, in which the Jewish population amounted to no more than 11% of the total population, the British tried gimmick after gimmick, con after con, to try and manufacture Palestinian consent to their rule. Federation, binationality, partition. Of course, the thing they didn't offer was the idea that the majority of the people in a country have a right of self-determination, a right that was extended to one extent or another to all the other emerging neighboring Arab states. An honest attempt. The Palestinian people tried. I need you to understand that. They didn't immediately just start hucking Molotovs at people and popping off, okay? I could list a lot of resolutions and people and events in this section, but let's just broad strokes this. The Palestine Arab Congress was a series of meetings at which interested parties gathered to implore the British governances to adhere to their word, as well as state the intentions and wishes of the Palestinian people. That brings me to another point. The Palestinian people. I say that, and I bet you're imagining simply Muslims if you don't know much about the region. Remember how I've been saying this entire time it was a rich, diverse, multicultural region? Well, the Palestine Arab Congresses were born out of the nationwide network of local Muslim Christian associations, with the initial person presiding over it, then Arif al-Dajani, who was the president of the Jerusalem Muslim Christian Society. There were 7 congresses in total, though not all were allowed to meet openly, given that along the way the British did what they do and began to make all Arab political gatherings outright illegal. Resolutions changed and shifted a bit over the course of their meetings, but you can generally sum up their resolutions with this: we are our own thing, we don't submit to control by outsiders. They ended up not being able to achieve their goals. They broke up, had changes over leadership. Some more isolationist Muslim veins of thought became more or less the mainstay of certain groups inside the Congresses. When all was said and done, they were surpassed by numerous political parties and interests. One further thing to note was, of course, the British responses to all of this was to establish further overseeing organizations in an attempt to further split the country by religion. The High Commissioner established the Supreme Muslim Council, but made the mistake of appointing Hajj Muhammad Amin al-Husani, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, to the head of the council, and he used this newfound power as one of the most influential people in Palestine to mobilize for nationalism behind the scenes. 2 events during this period solidified the Palestinian knowledge that they would be unable to work with the British, really. The first, we'll see a return of a character we already mentioned, Zev Jabotinsky. A right-wing Zionist group led by this weirdo took to marching through the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem's Old City, while Muslims were busy celebrating the birth of Prophet Moses. This special little snowflake had been secretly arming Jewish men and organizing them into self-defense groups, all the while spreading propaganda that the Muslims had a pogrom planned for them in March of that year, doing his damnedest to inflame tensions and kick something off. These same Hebrew press outlets were also publishing pieces campaigning for the building of the third Jewish temple on the Holy Mount at the site of the second temple, which was now occupied by the Haram al-Sharif compound, the third holiest site in Islam. Again, this is all magic woo-woo territory as far as I'm concerned, but it is incredibly important to all parties involved, so it must be treated as such. This is the location that Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven from, and is a big fucking deal. This led to open, repeated street fighting between young Arab and Jewish men, creating an atmosphere of tension and bubbling violence. Waves of violence ensued, notably the May Day events of 1921 in Jaffa, where Jewish Marxists, supposedly celebrating workers' unity, marched from Tel Aviv to Jaffa and began marching through Palestinian neighborhoods. The British, fearing what was coming, began firing warning shots, and the Palestinians, fearing for their safety from the seeming invasion, began to attack the marchers. 47 settlers and 48 Palestinians were killed. Things were uneasy, but manageable for now. The second was the fact that the British concerned themselves mainly with suppressing the Palestinian people and allowed the Zionists to build up infrastructure for what would become their future state. They were allowed to build their own educational systems, industries, and all other services that a state traditionally handles, even going so far as to establish Hebrew as the new language. The Jewish community was granted complete carte blanche to form a proto-state. Meanwhile, the Palestinian people were treated as colonial subjects. The settlers were allowed to build universities, while the Palestinians were seen through the lens of colonialism, meaning that educated masses were dangerous. Thus, the British denied them access and the ability to build new schools. The settlers were even granted so much leeway that they were allowed to establish their own military force, the Haganah, and not only establish, but the British actively coordinated and cooperated with them. This is the beginning of the end, really. Two parallel societies were now in existence with preferential treatment given to the Zionist settlers. It's about to get fucked up. Well, we all knew we'd have to get here eventually, right? This story has a clear, known trajectory, and we're about to enter the era of ethnic cleansing. The settlers would tolerate relying on the colonizing British force for only so long and move on to seek to colonize Palestine themselves. Many do not start the stages of ethnic cleansing as early as the 1920s, but I'm in agreement with Ilian Pape on this. Come out, ye. Let's take just a moment to recognize who many of the British troops and enforcers of the colonial power were and the background they came from as we move forward through history. When Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, wanted to establish a picked force of white gendarmerie for the colony, he sought to utilize men who had already served. Men who had served in the Irish War of Independence. And so it was Henry Tudor, the commander of the auxiliaries in Ireland, that advised Churchill that he had 800 absolutely reliable men available for the task. The auxiliaries worked alongside the Black and Tans during this period, with many considering them synonymous. They were forces of oppression whose reputations for brutality were extensive. You name it, they did it to the Irish: arson, looting, murder, and rape. And so when the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the treaty that ended the Irish War of Independence, was signed, creating the Irish Free State, the Irish Constabulary was officially disbanded. The same month that the terror force that had once inflicted itself upon the occupied Irish land had been disbanded, the former officers began to arrive on the shores of Palestine. The land. It started with the land. In 1920, the British administration changed the ownership rules from a more general, village-owned, and users of the land had to simply fulfill certain requirements to use it, to one that in practice meant that Zionist settlers could purchase as much land as they could afford, while also reclassifying Palestinian villagers as tenant farmers subject to landowner will. Between 1921 and 1925, the American Zion Commonwealth bought 80,000 acres of land in what is now the Jezreel Valley, then the Marj ibn Amir. In 1929, the Jewish National Fund bought 7,500 acres in what was then the Wadi Hawarith. Any guesses what happened to the Palestinian villagers and farmers who had lived and worked that land for countless generations? You guessed it, classic settler colonialism. Hostile takeover guised in the veneer of legality. They, with British authority behind them, began to forcibly evict them, as happened in India, the Americas, Australia, and the colonies the world over. People who had every right to the land by virtue of simply existing there since time immemorial were removed by an invading force that held up their magic paper and said, "Because this says you have to." Patrick Wolfe, the Australian expert in settler colonialism, has named this relationship between the mindset of a colonial settler and genocide as the logic of elimination. With the convergence of the two, elimination and genocide, and that as long as the elimination is not total, then the mindset of the settler will seek to strive its completion, ultimately resulting in acts of genocide. It starts with dehumanization, of course, as it always does. Early settler paintings didn't even include Palestinian villages in their landscapes. They described the Palestinians as savages or nomads, negating their claim to the villages and land. They, of course, had the old fallback tropes as well, making claims of modernization and bringing civilization to a backwards place. Make no mistake that while these messages serve to make the mission more palatable to those elsewhere, the early colonial settlers knew full well what they were doing and their intentions behind it. Palestinians en masse were beginning to be forced from their lands, with violent clashes becoming more frequent by the day. Much of this early work was done by socialist Zionist groups, collectively referred to as Zionist labor. They thought that Jews could only modernize themselves through productive labor. Thus, they wanted the agricultural work to fall under their purview. The few Jewish farmers who employed Palestinian farmhands, who knew the loss of knowledge this would incur, and those even fewer who dared to speak up, were publicly shamed into silence quickly. This could really only end up where we're headed next. A lightning strike. The Al-Barak Revolution. The Al-Barak was a winged half-mule, half-donkey that carried Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem and from there to heaven. But while there, he tied the creature to the Western Wall. This is important, apparently. Look, again, a lot of this is steeped in myth. On the 15th of August, 1929, the Haganah and the revisionist Zionists, you remember old troublemaker Jabotinsky, right? Staged demonstrations by the Western Wall, which caused the Muslim contingent to counter-protest the day after. Rumors spread, misinformation was disseminated, tensions flared, and away we go. Violence goes throughout the week, with 17 settlers being killed after Muslims' Friday prayers. This was the lit fuse that set off the chain of events that followed, and within 1 week, 133 Jewish settlers and 116 Palestinians were dead in the resulting violence. Unfortunately for everyone, the violence did not stay contained to Jerusalem either. It spread, most notably triggering the Hebron massacre. Recall once again that Palestine was multicultural. Hebron was home to Palestinian Jews that had existed there for centuries before the Zionist colonial settler invasion. They held a shared belief in the sacred nature of Hebron being the resting place of Abraham. Young Zionist yeshiva students who had been recent arrivals, largely dressed in modern clothing from Europe, were not seen as welcome, though. Muslim Palestinians from the surrounding villages who had received news about the events in Jerusalem descended upon the town, and 67 Jewish students were killed, with some managing to find refuge in the homes of the local Muslims' houses. But the die was cast. This event was to be seized upon by the Zionist settlers, and even Israel to this day, to justify the many massacres of Palestinians, as well as to prove that coexistence isn't a possibility. A decade. Functionally, an entire decade was spent by Palestinians watching their world be torn asunder, and now their social fabric was being shredded before their very eyes. They had been forced from their ancestral homelands, their farms ruined, forced into shanty towns such as the one in Haifa, thus resulting in the new use of a new form of resistance: guerrilla warfare. Izz al-Din al-Qassam. Enter stage right, a charismatic preacher, an imam originally from Syria who had fought against the French occupying forces so effectively that they saw him in particular as a threat and sentenced him to death. He pieced out and settled in Haifa and quickly made a name for himself teaching in the Istiqlal Mosque, which for now still stands. Al-Qassam, whose name you may recognize if you pay attention to events in Gaza, is the namesake of the military wing of Hamas. There's reason for that particular honor. With his knowledge and experience in anti-colonial action, he was particularly effective in inspiring young Muslims who lived in the shanty towns of Haifa. This, like most parts of our story, ended in tragedy, though, as he was stirred to premature action by a massive influx of Jewish settlers and increasing British surveillance, and in the hills of Jenin, he and 11 others, while fighting a British force that had superiority in numbers, were cornered, and in November of 1935, he and 4 other fighters were killed. Haifa declared a general strike the very next day. What the British didn't count on was what his death would do. It inspired countlessly increasing numbers of young Palestinians to take up arms and to fight a coming war. While some may judge him to have failed, his actions certainly paved the way for what would come. With no options left, the British, while dumb as rocks generally, did realize they had a problem on their hands and sent 2 separate commissions to find out what the hell was going on in the colony. One led by Walter Shaw and one led by John Hope. They both found that the violence was caused by Zionist projects of deposing Palestinians of their land and the Palestinian rejection of Zionism. The final conclusion was a recommendation to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine. What happened next reads so modern that it's hilariously pathetic. The British government, taking these reports into account, had a white paper drafted by Lord Sidney Webb proposing restricting land purchases and immigration of the Zionists and to chastise them for exacerbating Arab unemployment through their policies. Re-enter from stage left our lobbyist Chaim Weizmann once more, then leader of the World Zionist Organization, who had a chat with a few people, and the next thing you know, the Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald sent out a clarification of the white paper that amounted to a full retraction of it. Zionist activities on the ground would continue unimpeded. Al-Thura, Al-Abriya, Al-Kubra, the Great Arab Revolt. By 1936, the Palestinian leadership knew they had no means of recourse through petition of the Brits. Something else was called for. The Arab Higher Committee was formed as a working group to organize all the other organizations that had formed over the years from across the Palestinian Christian and Muslim community. Through this, they started with a 6-month strike, demanding an end to Jewish immigration, land purchases, and the formation of a Palestinian government. Whether it was intended to or unintended, that part is possibly lost, but what we do know is that the younger and rural elements of Palestinian society didn't just do a general strike. They staged an all-out revolt. British and Zionist forces were targeted relentlessly. 3 years. That's how long the revolt lasted, and during it, the British and Zionist forces used every tool at their disposal of a colonizing settler force. Collective punishment that's strikingly similar to what we see today was a common modus operandi. In June 1936, the British Army used explosives to blow up over 200 buildings in Jaffa's old city, rendering 6,000 Palestinians effectively homeless. The British tactics were as basic as their food: kill thousands of Palestinians, murder out as much knowledge and experience of the people as they could to not only put down the revolt, but hamper any future possible revolt through the elimination of any organizational knowledge that existed. The Peel Commission. The British, to their credit, made an inquiry a few months into the revolt to seek ways to resolve it, and the result from one such commission came back with an idea that would be the foundations of the apartheid state of Israel we see today. Partition in the form of the creation of a small Jewish state near what we now call Jordan. Anything strategic or religiously important would stay under British rule until future treaties would be signed between the two states. As for Palestinians occupying the lands that were to be sectioned off for the Zionist settlers, transfer. The Arab Higher Committee rejected this idea outright. Time for another name you may know to enter the fray. One David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, saw a multi-step maneuver that could be executed, and in spite of the demands that were coming from within the Zionist movement, he struck a deal with the British. He saw the potential in this small swath of land. First, they were still small in numbers, so strategically having more land would make it more difficult to hold. Second, it didn't mean they couldn't take more land later. And third, he knew the Palestinians would reject the offer, thus further ingratiating the Zionists with the British. The Brits, to their credit once more, realized none of this was going to work actually and formed another commission, the Woodhead Commission. They basically stated that partition was a huge injustice, taking lands was a huge injustice, and none of this nonsense was going to work at all. They proposed an even more convoluted strategy involving multiple states, multiple mandate territories, and a customs union. It was here that Britain began to back away slowly like Homer into the hedge. In May of 1939, the British government published a white paper stating it had fulfilled the obligations of the Balfour Declaration, that there were now over 450 Jewish settlers in Palestine and they now had a national home. It further recommended that Palestine become an independent state in 10 years and should be jointly governed. Furthermore, Jewish land purchases would be limited for the next 5 years. Everyone was pissed. By the way, you might have noticed that date, May 1939. Was there anything important happening around that time in Europe? Yeah. Hitler. What would this story be without a visit from everyone's favorite vegetarian Austrian painter? Actually, this section is thankfully very short, as not much needs to be said. During this time, the actions of old Tweaky McFuckface hardened Zionist attitudes, causing any remaining sentiment to compromise with Palestinians to go up in smoke. At the New York Biltmore Hotel in May of 1942, the Zionist leadership declared their intention to turn all of historical Palestine into a Jewish state. It was during this period that laid the understanding and groundwork for the future Zionist lobbying in the New World, as they came to understand that their futures may lie in the hands of the Americans. Palestinian leadership during this period was also lacking. Most of it was either dead, in jail, or in exile from years of the Arab Revolt. The main figure in Palestinian politics at the time was Haj Mohammed Amin al-Husseini. You remember him? Yeah, the guy appointed by the British. When the revolt broke out, the Arab Higher Committee was declared illegal. He was relieved of his position, and the British authorities later issued an arrest warrant for him. He, understandably, GTFO'd and escaped to Damascus. This is where things often get slightly overblown. Can't imagine how that happens. He then lived by the same maxim that many at the same time did. Molotov-Ribbentrop, anyone? And fled to Germany. From there, he made radio broadcasts trying to mobilize the Arab Muslims against the British. This is really the extent of his time in Germany and is often overblown to discredit Palestinian liberation movements, sometimes to insane levels, as such when Netanyahu tried to claim it was Haj Amin who gave Hitler the idea for the camps. In either case, with Haj Amin in exile and the rest of the Palestinian leadership criminalized, the Zionist organizations were free to de-Arabize Palestine with the Americans' blessings. The Zionist lobbyists simply had more influence than any Arab organization within the American political system. Following the Second World War, and with European nations looking to cleanse their consciences and their lands of Jews still, remember, even after the extermination of 6 million Jews, there were still around 250,000 of them displaced in camps, being refused entry by European nations in America. The prospect of a Jewish homeland became ever more attractive. The three processes. The failure of diplomacy, traitors in the midst, and Zionist preparations. 3 rivers, 3 streams, 3 confluences that lead into the Nakba. It was these cluster of events that laid the groundwork for the catastrophe that would befall the Palestinian people. Let's take it from the top, shall we? 1. The Brits suck at everything. Even after the Second World War, the British were still hopeful that they could somehow diplomacy their way out of the mess they created. Of course, they couldn't actually do it themselves, so they once again called the cavalry, and in November of 1945, the Americans and British formed the Anglo-American Committee, tasked with resolving the conflict before the end of the mandate. They sent the committee to Palestine in early 1946 and filed their report in April of that same year. They achieved much while there. They successfully documented demography, economy, education, and politics. The report is still used to this very day as a resource for scholars. What they didn't achieve? Any real idea as to how to fix anything. They concluded that maybe it should just stay in Mandate. Finally, it was sinking in for the Brits that this was impossible. Post-war Britain was in shambles. The new Labour government saw the colonies as expenses they couldn't afford. The Zionists were getting completely out of pocket, forcing them to realize they couldn't deliver on their promises to recognize the rights of Palestinians. And with Zionists conducting regular terror attacks on them, see the July 1946 attack by the Zionist organization Irgun, in which they blew up the British Mandate central offices in the King David Hotel, killing 91 people, they needed a way out. And so, on February 1st, 1947, with no end in sight, the British folded officially and referred the whole matter to the now 2-year-old United Nations. The UN, still young and having none of the yet-to-be decolonized world in it, was simply a battleground for the US and USSR at this point, with no experience settling decades-long conflicts. The UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, submitted its final report in September of 1947 recommending partition. The Palestinians, represented by the Arab Higher Committee, rightfully boycotted the process, maintaining that they should get the same deal that was struck with all the neighboring Arab nations and gain independence once their mandate ended. The UN treated this one case as an exemption with no satisfactory explanation as to why. 2. Secret dealings with the British. The Arab world supported the Palestinian rejection of UNSCOP via the newly formed Arab League, but what no one counted on was the two-timing double dealing of the British and the absolute fuckwittery that can ensue from it. Enter Transjordan. No, we didn't just Transjordan. That's what the modern-day country of Jordan used to be called back when it was a British protectorate. It, too, was a claimed piece of the Ottoman Empire that got colonized by our favorite pasty bastards. The real problem here is when Britain started making promises to a bunch of people it couldn't keep, oftentimes to opposing sides even. Really, all you need to know is a local group, the Hashemites, are at the center of all of this, and Britain promised them kingdoms and crowns, Iraq and Syria actually, if they fought against the Ottomans for the British. The Hashemites held up their end of the bargain, and Britain, having made deals with the French via Sykes-Picot Agreement, couldn't actually give Syria away anymore, and when the House of Saud went to claim the Hijaz region, making it a part of Saudi Arabia, the British didn't help the Hashemites once again. Look, this gets weird and convoluted, but none of it really matters. This is where Lawrence of Arabia happens. Places are taken, places are occupied, people fight and die, lands are divided up and claimed. Enter Winston Churchill, who basically gives Transjordan, which includes a piece of mandatory Palestine, to a guy named Abdullah, and it becomes its own state. Our favorite recurring antagonist, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and his party of psychos did not accept this loss of land, and to this day they claim it. But from the beginning of all of this, Abdullah had been communicating and cooperating with the Jewish Agency, the effective Zionist administration for the area, and by the time of UNSCOP had developed this into a working relationship. They had come to an agreement that Transjordan could expand into more fertile parts of mandatory Palestine if he supported the establishment of a Jewish state. So when all the other Arab League leadership boycotted the meeting, Abdullah was the only one to show up, and he did what all good self-serving traitors do. It was after this that the Arab League began forming the Arab Liberation Army. 3. They came prepared. Unlike the Palestinians, the Zionists saw the end of the mandate period as not one to seek international legitimacy, as that had already failed them during the Shoah. They sought to get boots on the ground and to make moves. They spent 1945 to 1947 preparing to take over the entire country's administration instead. Having correctly surmised an extraordinarily cynical insight, might I add, that the international community wouldn't give two shits about the Palestinians if they just took the place over, they prepared to simply take Palestine by force. They actively planned to take all key points as soon as the British left. You name it. Telecommunications, railways, roads, mail services, banking, anything and everything. Over those 2 years, they built up their military forces, acquiring arms from abroad and creating the conscription system for all Jewish settlers. Using the Haganah, which had transformed itself from a militia force into what the British considered to be the second most powerful military in the Middle East, they recruited from everywhere, especially displaced Jews from Europe. It was seen as an easier route into a land than even getting a visa to somewhere else. Resolution 181, the death knell. November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passes Resolution 181, declaring itself in favor of partition of Palestine. Zionists cheered, Palestinians wept. The groundwork was now laid for the Nakba. The catastrophe. Sometime between 1943 or 1944, a Polish Jewish man working as a lawyer and an academic coined a term that would forever permeate the sphere of language. His name was Raphael Lemkin, and while you may not know his name, you know his word, genocide. Lemkin, while working as a law student, became aware of the Ottoman Empire's persecution of Armenians during the First World War and noted the lack of international methods for dealing with the officials who carried out war crimes. After the Germans invaded Poland, he fled to the USA and worked at Duke University. The word genocide derived from ancient Greek, genos, meaning family, tribe, race, stock, kin, and side from the Latin citium or killing, was included in his 1944 research piece entitled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, in which he documented the mass killings by the Nazis of groups deemed to be Untermensch or subhumans. After the Second World War, it was Lemkin who worked with Robert H. Jackson, the chief U.S. prosecutor for the Nuremberg trials, though they failed to properly hold those responsible accountable, in large part in Lemkin's opinion because there was no international legal framework for the concept of genocide at the time. It was through his dedicated advocacy for an international genocide standard that on December 9, 1948, the United Nations passed the Genocide Convention, largely based upon Lemkin's proposals. What you need to know is that it is fairly clear in its outlay. Let's just go straight in. Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as such. Any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of that group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within that group, and forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. Article 3 defines the crimes that can be punished under the Convention: genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. Beta testing genocide and cucking Americans. The Zionist forces knew that the Palestinians would reject the UN resolution and prepared for just such an outcome. In fact, they didn't just prepare for it, they were counting on it to provide cover for what was to come. Knowing that the Palestinian people would resist such theft of their lands through partition, the now militarized forces gathered, waiting for the moment to emerge with which they could begin testing out their ideas for the wholesale ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. As small skirmishes erupted between Palestinian villagers and Zionist settlers, the Zionist forces would use them as an excuse to engage in collective punishment, clearing entire areas of Palestinian Arabs to make way for what would become the Jewish state of Israel. In February of 1948, one such example is laid bare for all to see. 3 thriving villages around the ancient Roman city of Caesarea were subject to such cleansing. So thorough was the job done by the Zionist military forces that they nearly completely erased all historical record of them existing entirely. The villagers themselves forced to leave en masse or be killed outright, all while the British sat by and presided over the entire mess. During these initial test runs, the amount of operations were overall limited, used sporadically and justified, as always, as proportionate violence. By the end of February of 1948, though, it was clear the attacks by the Zionist forces were becoming more intense and unrelenting, now no longer hampered by such pretenses such as self-defense, simply outright engaging in mass expulsions. This drew the attention of the U.S. State Department, which had an established track record of skepticism towards this whole partition endeavor, and in a Hail Mary attempt to achieve peace, the U.S.'s UN representative, Warren Austin, presented a proposal to place Palestine under national trusteeship for 5 years. Cue the Zionist lobby once more, and the very day prior to the public statement by Austin, Chaim Weizmann meets with President Truman, in which he managed to receive assurances of American support for partition. Mobilizing its now even more powerful lobby in the USA and using a tactic that would continue to serve them for generations to come, they seized upon the fact that it was an election year, and within a few short weeks, the US government publicly dropped the trusteeship idea and reinforced their support for partition. Dalet. March 10th, 1948. 10 men gathered in a house built to be the local workers' council head office, but was destined to become the clandestine headquarters of the Haganah up until it would be returned to use in the 1970s as the main office for Israel's kibbutzim movement, once again associated with the Zionist version of socialism. This building no longer stands. It was razed to make room for a car park for the Sheraton Hotel next door. These men would include David Ben-Gurion, veteran generals from the Haganah intelligence unit, as well as young Jewish officers. Together, they would put together a plan, Plan D, or Dalet in Hebrew. It was the 4th such plan they had devised, hence the name. This plan was simple in its aim: remove as many Palestinians from Palestine as possible. That same evening, the details were sent to the units on the ground in preparation of what was to come: the systematic expulsion of Palestinians from their lands by whatever means necessary. The orders rendered upon those soldiers came with detailed descriptions and methodology to be used. 1. Surround the village on 3 sides, leaving a 4th for Palestinians to flee in terror through. 2. Lay siege to the village, set fire to the homes, properties, and goods. 3. Total demolition. Destroy all the buildings, reducing the village to rubble using explosives. 4. Plant mines in the rubble to prevent return. Each unit was given its own list of villages and neighborhoods to attack, resulting in widespread destruction of both rural and urban environments. Though the instructions didn't stop at the core tactics, they also included more horrific instructions to the troops. There was reference to men being defined as young as 10 years of age, should be killed or arrested as well. His plan also relied upon the Haganah's intelligence, which was vast and detailed. During the run-up in the 1940s, they had amassed extraordinary amounts of information about every village in Palestine, including details on the village's wealth, political structure, key people, internal relationships, even how many fruit trees were had. And you better believe included in those files were a list of names of everyone they could identify who had participated in the Arab Revolt. If found, they were to be arrested, or what more commonly occurred, executed on the spot. March, April, and May were spent largely targeting the urban centers, in which has been described as urbicide, as they were destroyed in totality, with the Palestinian people having been expelled from Acre, Bisan, Haifa, Jaffa, Safed, and Tiberias, as well as any surrounding village. Let's take a moment to look at one instance in particular, the April 9th, 1948 raid on the village of Deir Yassin. Right-wing terror groups, the Irgun and Stern gang, laid siege upon the village, entering the houses methodically and killing all the inhabitants, men, women, children. None were spared, and within the blink of an eye, over 100 people were dead. This strategy worked as the villages nearby fled in fear for their lives, allowing for easy demolition and mining of their villages. It's also worth noting where many of these terrorists ended up after the operations. They were integrated into the Israeli army in a move carried out by the Haganah. It took 6 months for Plan B to be executed. 800,000 people, over half of Palestine's native population, had been expelled from their ancestral homelands. 15,000 people, almost all civilians, had been callously exterminated. 531 villages had been destroyed and 11 urban areas completely emptied. Not only did they attack from the ground, but also from the air, starting a tradition of indiscriminate civilian casualties using bombs dropped from on high that stretches to today. One such example would be the village of Safaria, which was one of the first to be targeted and terrorized in this modern way. Fraught with fear, the women took the children away, seeking refuge in the nearby caves, while the men prepared what inadequate rifles they had around. What follows is information from a direct first-hand account of a survivor of the massacre by the name of Al-Hajj Abu Salim, who was 27 at the time of the attack. Quote, "The women and the children were quickly exposed by the Jews, and my mother was killed by the troops. She was trying to enter the Church of Annunciation, and they dropped a bomb that hit her in the stomach." The village and anyone caught were not spared, and so those who could fled. They ran until they couldn't hear the explosions any longer, and they then began to seek refuge once more. Abu Salim, in 2001, then 80 years of age, stated that he was still willing to buy his own house back, quote, "with good money," if they let him. It was on the sites of these villages, Muslim and Christian alike, that Israel built Jewish settlements and recreational parks. The burned fields planted with imported European pine trees, erasing in their eyes the Arabness that once disgusted them and replacing it with their ersatz version of the Middle East. One more European colony in a land which it did not belong. But what about the other Arab states? Well, let's start this with understanding that the surrounding states were newly minted and still working through the process of decolonization, so they were wrought with instability anyway. The largest army was Egypt's, but it wasn't a professional army, though they did make up for that in support for the Palestinian cause, as half of their ranks were made up of members of the Muslim Brotherhood who recognized the greater anti-imperial implications. The problem is that the Egyptian government, on the other hand, would have happily stayed out of it entirely and successfully delayed authorization of military action until 2 days before the end of the mandate period. That would be May 14, 1948, well into the execution of Plan D. In addition to delaying deployment, their equipment and training both were severely lacking in quality. That brings us to old traitor to the cause himself, King Abdullah. The Jordanian army was arguably the most professional army in the region, but due to his two-timing ways, that amounts to jack all. He had already reached an agreement with the Zionist leadership to allow Jordan to annex the West Bank as long as they stood by and allowed Zionist forces to conduct their extermination campaign. The complication here was that Abdullah also had agreements to the Arab League and was a required participant in that, so he had to tread carefully. The Arab League drew up plans under his direction in which the Jordanian army would enter Palestine and join up with the Egyptian army in the south. You can guess how that went. The army didn't enter in most places and didn't meet up with Egypt. The Egyptian army didn't have their logistics down, and as a result of that had meager success at best. By mid-August, the Arab League had failed to prevent the completion of Plan D. The UN's attempt. With crimes against humanity having been committed in plain sight for all to see, the UN did attempt to appoint a mediator, one Count Folke Bernadotte, an accomplished negotiator who had freed 15,000 concentration camp prisoners during the Second World War. He was tasked with finding a solution. He proposed that a revision was needed to the partition plan, redrawing territories and adjusting for demographies. This, of course, would mean more land for the Palestinians, as well as being allowed to return to their former homes, and Jerusalem would become an international enclave. On September 7, 1948, he was assassinated by the Stern Gang, with multiple historians all suspecting it was on direct order from Zionist leadership, though they've successfully managed to prevent any record of that from existing. Resolution 149. An oft ignored, it would seem, resolution was passed in December of 1948, entitled Resolution 149, that affirmed that refugees have a right of return, that Jerusalem is an international locality, and negotiations for a two-state solution on the basis of borders set in the 1947 Partition Resolution must be met. To enable and implement this, the Conciliation Commission for Palestine was formed. On April of 1949, in Lausanne, Switzerland, the commission met. In attendance were representatives from Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. Israel took part only because it was a condition of their membership acceptance to the UN forced upon them. Out of this commission came what was known as the Lausanne Protocol. It was that all parties agreed to continue negotiations while acknowledging the three main principles of Resolution 149. Israel immediately denied having agreed to it as everyone else understood it. Within a year, the Commission stopped looking for a solution, and the UN finalized the armistice agreements with the surrounding Arab nations, thus birthing the newly minted Israeli state. UNRWA. You've probably heard a lot about this group, given Israel's hatred for them and the media's complicity in their propaganda efforts. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency was founded in 1950 as a means to provide aid for the now 1 million Palestinian refugees, building refugee camps, providing food, water, medical aid for Palestinian refugees who, due to the right of return, did not often accept citizenship elsewhere, even in the rare chance they were offered it, given that they did not want to convey that they were accepting of their dispossession. And the only decent thing that Jordan did through this entire shit show was found as an offering of citizenship to the Palestinian refugees that had found themselves in Jordan. Approximately half seem to have taken them up on that offer. Others, like Lebanon, refused to grant citizenship to Palestinian refugees, instead forcing them to stay in displaced persons camps. This phenomenon of refugees not only extended to the neighboring Arab states, but also internally, as approximately 300,000 Palestinians were refugees in their own land, with the inability to resettle due to Israeli occupation. Israel now refers to these people as internally displaced persons. The two that got away. Make no mistake about it, the newly formed Israelis didn't just want a little piece, or even a large piece. They wanted it all. As far as they were concerned, the entire region belonged to them. So with the completion of Plan D, there were the Baruch assaults within their society that immediately decried the loss of Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank, of course, not lost to them because of any military failings, but because of simple statesmanship and the horse trading they had done with Abdullah. But that decision would never be fully accepted as policy and would continue to be classified as Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. Gaza, on the other hand, very much lost to them due to the steadfast nature of the Egyptians, which had successfully staved off Zionist attempts to grab it. There's a ton of mini events from this time that could easily be delved into, but suffice it to say that forces within Israel spent decades rabble-rousing, inciting, provoking, and making up reasons to try and violate agreements made with their neighboring Arab states. Chief amongst them was David Ben-Gurion, architect of the Nakba. They would near constantly be making up intangible threats as reasons to violate the sovereignty of other nations, tilting at invisible communists and chasing radicals, a pattern that has never ceased. Arab Jews. Before we move on, let's address the truly multicultural nature of the region once again. We've talked about the Muslims and the Christians, but what of the Arab Jews that had peacefully coexisted throughout the region since before Christianity and Islam were even created? Well, you see, the Zionists weren't exactly huge fans. In fact, they were downright racist towards them. Shocking, I know. They saw them as nothing more than further Arab savages that needed dealing with, but one thing that changed all that: the Shoah. The Holocaust had destroyed European Jewish communities and left the entire population at 1/3 its former size. And so, cynically as ever, they sought to recruit them. How? By basically engaging in widespread terror campaigns designed to create an environment of fear and hate, so they felt they had no choice but to flee their homes to join Israel or go abroad. I wish I was fucking kidding. For example, in Iraq, one of the oldest Jewish communities on the planet, Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, began what it is most widely known for today: terror campaigns and assassinations abroad. They conducted false flag operations targeting the Iraqi Jewish community, planting bombs in businesses, community centers, synagogues, and even a home. When they attacked the Musura Shem Tov synagogue, they killed, amongst others, a 12-year-old boy. They didn't stop there. They also made a backroom deal with Iraq's Prime Minister, Nuri al-Said, to pass legislation that targeted the Iraqi Jews further, spurring them to leave. Another great example would be in 1954 in Egypt, where they recruited a bunch of young men in order to commit terror attacks against what were seen as Western targets, such as cinemas and libraries, hoping to damage Egypt's relationship with the West. The terrorists were caught, however, and the entire thing became known as the Lavon Affair, but the damage was done. The Egyptian Jews, fearing reprisal and increased hostilities, fled. In Yemen, they used the nature of the more religiously observant Yemeni Jews to their advantage, convincing them that their return was a fulfillment of the messianic prophecy, and that would be the beginning of the redemption of their people. Over the following decades, through false flag campaigns of terror and Western-backed propaganda efforts, they managed to equate Zionism with Judaism. And amidst this atmosphere of fear they themselves cultivated towards Arab and North African Jews, most ended up fleeing their homelands for the new nation of Israel. But make no mistake, these Arab Jews were seen as inferior and treated as such. Upon arrival, they were sprayed with DDT and ritualistic humiliation scenes. They then proceeded to use colonial methods employed the world over for dealing with indigenous cultures. They broke large families apart, creating artificial nuclear families, educated the young only in Hebrew schools while brainwashing them using the propaganda of the state to believe in the divine nature of Israel. All the while treating Arab Jews as second-class citizens, marginalizing them, locating them into poorer border towns, and forcing them into unskilled, read low-paying jobs. The only path out of this was to renounce and disavow your Arabness, wholly and unconditionally. The ones who survived, the ones who made it in Israeli society, now comprise one of the largest hard-right voting blocs in society and are generally the most rabidly anti-Palestinian, regularly advocating for further violence against them. The legacy of the Nakba. Understand that all of this not only killed, maimed, destroyed buildings and farms, but was also designed to make it impossible to reconstruct a Palestinian nation. Israel didn't just seek to knock down some buildings and move some people around. They sought to erase the Palestinians from existence. They committed genocide, and the world sat by and watched. And it wouldn't be the only time. Occupation. Following the wholesale ethnic cleansing of over half of Palestinians, the Israelis now took the necessary steps to hold on to their ill-gotten gains. In order to maintain order, military rule for those who were not Zionists must be established. Any Palestinians within their borders would be placed under the direct purview of their military forces for decades to come. For the formation of this tactic, they drew inspiration once again from the British, in the form of the British emergency regulations that gave an army absolute control over people's lives. Rules such as no reason needed expulsion, detention without trial, shooting them, and the ransacking of businesses. Sound familiar? They forced curfews on the entirety of the population, randomly, and often without advance notification. Take, for example, the curfew placed upon Kfir Qasim during October of 1956. claiming the Palestinians would side with the Egyptian leader Nasser, who was busy nationalizing the Suez Canal and fending off colonizing forces from Britain, France, and Israel. They imposed a curfew on this village that was nowhere near Egypt. And on Monday, the 29th of October at 4:30 p.m., they enacted their policy without informing the villagers, who were mostly working in the fields that afternoon and had no way of knowing that any man, woman, or child outside after 5 p.m. would be shot dead on sight. As the people of Kafir Qasim began to return home in the early evening, the Israelis opened fire, killing 49 people. We're going to attempt to speed up a bit through these next few abuses just because they're so numerous that we could spend the next 3 days discussing the documented cases, and we'd still only scratch the surface, but we'll break it into a few categories. Looting. The Zionists took everything they could. There was both systematic and organized confiscation via the militarized forces, as well as sporadic private looting by settlers themselves. The official type of theft was ordered directly by the government, and they targeted stores of food needed to maintain the Palestinian populace, such as barley, flour, rice, sugar, and wheat. The Palestinians found that no matter where the resources were stored, they were taken, whether they be at religious sites, community centers, or warehouses. This practice actually began even before the execution of Plan D, with the British soldiers watching on as Jewish settlers were allowed to ransack Palestinian food storage locations. The second type were just blatant robberies. Settlers took everything that wasn't nailed down, and if there was someone that tried to stop them, they could and would easily just run to the military, and soon there would be more Palestinian bodies to be added to the mass graves. They would commit bold-faced daytime robberies of houses, taking clothing, furniture, cooking implements, anything the settlers could practically use or they didn't want the Palestinians to have. Desecration of holy sites. They took it all. There's no way to undersell how insane this is. Up until 1948, all Muslim holy sites in Palestine belonged to an endowment called the Waqf. The Ottomans respected this. Hell, the British respected this. It meant no one person or group could control these sacred sites and was overseen by a body of local religious dignitaries. Israel confiscated all endowments, all properties in them, and sold them off to Jewish organizations and private citizens. They didn't stop at the Muslim holy sites either, though. Christians weren't immune from this thieving. The Christian churches had much of their land seized, but unlike the Muslim sites, many of the churches were left standing, though quite a few were partially destroyed, along with most of their mosque counterparts. Israel actually has a policy of leaving these structures left partly standing to remain, to look ancient, in order to act as a reminder of Israel's might. The Muslim holy sites, too numerous to name, were raised to have Jewish sites built atop them. Rape. There are 4 types of sources that allow for us to know what occurred with regard to this heinous act, and thus we know for certain that severe cases of rape did happen. What remains difficult to ascertain is the scope of how many children and women were victimized by the Israelis in this way. First up are the international bodies, such as the Red Cross and the UN, who had officials on the ground who submitted reports, such as the Red Cross official de Mourian, who, while in Jaffa, recorded specific examples, such as one incident where the Israeli soldiers killed a brother and then gang-raped the sister. He also notes generalities, such as how the Palestinian men would be taken away and their, quote, their women left to the mercy of the Israelis. Another Red Cross report documenting an incident from December 9, 1948 that stated that 2 soldiers suddenly entered in the house of Al-Hajj Suleiman Daoud, hit his wife, and kidnapped his 18-year-old daughter. The father managed to get his daughter back by speaking with an Israeli lieutenant with the Brigade 7. They had her for 17 days. Second are simple, documented, contemporaneous reports by those outside of the international organizations that refer to the occurrence, such as the governor of Jaffa, Yitzhak Shizek, when writing in one such letter stated, quote, about the rapes, sir, you probably have heard. In an even earlier letter to Ben Gurion He recounted how, quote, a group of soldiers had burst into a house, killed the father, injured the mother, and raped the daughter. The third source are Israeli archives themselves. That's right, they documented their own crimes like psychos often seem to do. Except the only instances they would record were if the perpetrator were actually brought to trial. But we have a nifty little workaround for this. One David Ben-Gurion. As when a soldier was caught, he was to be informed personally, and he actually wrote about it in his diaries. His daily diary, and every few days he includes a subsection in his little genocide journal entitled Rape Cases. Every few days. An example of one such instance is another case that Governor Chizik had reported to him. Quote, a case in Akre where soldiers wanted to rape a girl. They killed the father and wounded the mother, and the officers covered for them. At least one soldier raped the girl. End quote. Battalion 3, the group responsible for the massacres committed in Kiasa, Sasa, and Safad, was so notorious for its savagery that even the Israeli High Command suspected them of being responsible for most rapes in Jaffa. That brings us to the fourth and final source for documenting the widespread and systematic raping of the Palestinians by the Israeli forces, the oral histories themselves, the accounts of the survivors of the atrocities, as well as the perpetrators. For an example of one case from the mouths of the monsters themselves, take the story published on October 9th, 2003 by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, based on the testimonies of soldiers who committed the unthinkable. 22 soldiers had raped, tortured, and killed a girl. August 12, 1949, a platoon in Negev, close to today's northern edge of Gaza, captured a 12-year-old girl. For days, they kept her as the platoon's sex slave, shaving her head, gang raping her, and murdering her. This case can be cross-verified as it is accounted for in Ben-Gurion's diaries as well, but was censored by editors. When brought to trial, the most severe sentence for the soldier was for the soldier that had actually done the killing, and he got 2 years. Events like this became regular and commonplace for decades on end. The Palestinians didn't simply sit by, though. During these times, resistances were born out of the refugee camps. While the West Bank had a sense of Palestinian identity, still, it was from Gaza that the national identity of Palestinians came out full tilt. At first, they simply sought to retrieve the pieces of their lives that had been left behind, animals, personal possessions, etc. But with the Israeli forces still occupying those now destroyed villages and given shoot-on-sight orders, they quickly realized they would have to assume other tactics. The Fedayeen and the response. Those ready to sacrifice themselves. That's what Fedayeen means in Arabic. They were guerrilla units formed to target Israelis. This was the start of what would become the pattern until this very day. Palestinian guerrilla fighters versus the Western-backed and well-armed Israeli military. The Fedayeen in Gaza began to coordinate with programs led by Palestinian students in exile from places such as Egypt, Kuwait, and Lebanon, eventually forming what came to be known by the inverted acronym Fatah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. They would conduct operations such as the attempt to blow up the national water carrier, which Israel was using to divert water from the Jordan River. These activities quickly became a thorn in the side of the Israelis, and under the command of Ariel Sharon, a name you might recognize, by order of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Oh yeah, our old war criminal friend got a promotion, by the way. Unit 101 was formed. An elite military unit whose mission was extrajudicial retribution missions that regularly ignored national boundaries, crossing into neighboring states with impunity. This was Israel's first special operations unit. One that bypassed normal lines of command to answer directly to the IDF High Command. Quote, the Palestinians must learn they will pay a high price for Israeli lives. that is David Ben-Gurion to Ariel Sharon. This unit recruited exclusively from the more rural and radical kibbutzim and moshevim settler movements by invitation only, and requiring all new members to be voted on by the unit's existing membership. And they did exactly what was expected of them. They engaged in further war crimes at the order of the IDF High Command. Take the Kibbeh massacre, for example, in which the unit raided the village of Kibbeh in northern West Bank, a part of Jordan, killing 42 villagers and wounding 15 more, while also carrying on the tradition of Plan D by demolishing houses with explosives. Evidence available readily showed that many of the inhabitants had been in their houses when their residences were blown up and fell onto their bodies, crushing them to death, oftentimes slowly. The Israelis denied direct responsibility, blaming rogue settlers and a local kibbutz that had acted without an order from the IDF. What became of Unit 101? Did the IDF, after international outcry, decide to change tactics, issue an apology, put those responsible on trial? No. Chief of Staff General Moshe Dayan decided that due to the resounding success of Unit 101, that they needed to expand the program and share their experience with the rest of the IDF as a whole, starting with Paratroopers Battalion 890. That then merged and merged again and again until Ariel Sharon was commander of multiple battalions. The Palestinian National Council. In 1964, the Arab League, led by Nasser of Egypt, convened a meeting of 422 representatives in Jerusalem in order to establish the Palestinian National Covenant. This was the meeting during which the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was established as the formal expression of the political will of the Palestinian people, mostly comprised at that time of the former leaders of Mandatory Palestine. But the PLO was seen as a more mainstream expression, and more radical Palestinians joined actual leftist pan-Arab movements that would eventually give form to left-wing groups within the PLO, such as the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Or others still joined such things as the Communist parties, or Pan-Syrian parties, or even the Ba'ath Party, who advocated for socialist pan-Arab unity. The Ba'ath Party would become the dominant party in both Iraq and Syria. No land left behind. Remember those two that got away? Yeah, Israel doesn't play like that. This is a colonial settler project after all. It's for keeps, and colonial settlers want it all. It's a mind virus of sorts. Greed and ego run amok on a grand scale. Israel is always looking for excuses, reasons to justify its claim that it stands alone, besieged upon all sides, thus necessitating its ability to ask for unlimited assistance from the West. The problem is that wasn't always true. Throughout the 1950s, and despite his commitment to the Palestinians' return to their land, Nasser was always willing and seeking to work with Israel. The problem is he never had any willing or reliable counterparts on the Israeli side. And let's not forget Jordan's King Abdullah, who had been two-timing the Arab states and working with Israel before Israel even existed. So this narrative they attempted to craft, dating back to the founding of the state, is simply not true, but they'd have their next justification for further ethnic cleansing and land grabs soon enough. The Suez Canal. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser Hussein nationalized the Suez Canal and demanded the British out, which angered the imperial core. And so the British, French, and Israelis cooked up a scheme to topple Nasser and retake the canal. A couple things to note here. Once again, the Americans were actually innocent in this and were not made aware of the two-timing bullshit this trio were getting up to. In fact, Eisenhower, who was president at the time, told the British we'd collapse their economy if they invaded Egypt, a threat that was possible to follow through on by selling all of the American government's bonds of pounds sterling. Keep in mind, for the purposes of brevity, I'm going to leave a lot out of this section because it gets really spiderweb-like and deep due to the fact that now we're in the era of Cold War worry, American and Soviet tensions and all of that. Everybody was jockeying for what they saw as critical positions and trying to stop the spread of communism and capitalism, respectively. What's important to note, to note in all of this is two things. The first is that 3 countries failed to topple Nasser. Fun aside, some historians point to this moment as the collapse of the British Empire. Thank fuck. And the second is Nasser couldn't get it out of his mind that Israel wouldn't stop there, and he had to do something to try and stop them. In 1958, he convinced the Syrian government to join the Egyptian government in unifying as one entity entitled the United Arab Republic. It lasted 3 years, but despite its short shelf life, it did succeed in creating close allies of the two countries, united in their fear of Israeli expansionism, militarism, and terrorism. This alliance grew despite Jordan's opposition to the UAR, and in May of 1967, they joined Egypt in a defensive pact, largely due to Israeli diversion of the River Jordan and the fact that Jordanian borders with Israel had become a battlefield for over a decade at this point, with cross-border incursions having been a regular occurrence between Fatah, the Palestinian guerrillas operating from the West Bank, and Israeli forces whose brutality was now becoming legendary, see Unit 101 and their progeny battalions. The Israeli forces weren't known for holding back either, just because Jordanian people or their military forces happened to be there either, as in November of 1966 when they attacked the village of Samu, but ended up attacking a group from the Jordanian army that was there, killing 15 soldiers and 1 pilot. The Greater Israel Crew, comprised of old generals that conducted the first genocide, labor movement ideologues, and young religious zealots from the Merkaz Harav, the Rabbi Center, who were devotees of one Zvi Cook. Remember that guy? Who had taught them that colonizing Gaza and the West Bank was God's will. Trademark. This group of high-functioning psychopaths and cult members occupied the upper ranks of Israeli government and society and were constantly trying to convince whoever was prime minister at the time, or really whoever would listen to them, that violating their agreements was justified, that there was an imminent attack from just over there, and Israel needs to seize the land and expel or exterminate the people. Really just a stand-up bunch. They tried with David Ben-Gurion several times. In 1958 by claiming Jordan was about to be taken over by pro-Nasserites and they just must act. In 1960, when Nasser thought Israel was going to attack Syria and thus his preparations for that were cause for attack, etc., etc., etc. Let's just say that this group has one record they play, and they play it all day and night. In 1963, though Ben-Gurion was removed from politics, and despite everything he had done and participated in, it became readily apparent he seemed to have been holding back the tide of crazy, which, given what the fuck he got up to, is saying something. The government quickly created a special working group of experts to plan on how to rule Gaza and the West Bank after their eventual Israeli capture. The person placed at the head of this team was Michael Shaham, who also just happened to be the person whose job it was to oversee the military rule of the Palestinian people. From him, we get the name of the Shaham Plan. Stated guidelines for how to construct a military legal system during occupation in order to control the populace. The Six-Day War. June 5th, 1967, Israel struck, attacking the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It was a swift and decisive victory. In 6 days, 15,000 more Arabs had been killed, as well as 15 UN peacekeepers who had been targeted by Israeli forces, and 34 U.S. sailors when the Israelis targeted and purposefully sank the USS Liberty in either an attempt to disable potential signals intelligence gathering that may have been passed to the Egyptians, or in order to try and conduct a false flag and lure the U.S. into a conflict with Egypt. The true reason? Still shrouded in mystery, but everyone involved has never believed the Israeli explanations of, oops-a-doodle, the pilot didn't see the flag. When all is said and done, in addition to the thousands more dead, hundreds of thousands more have been expelled. 325,000 Palestinians from the West Bank, 100,000 Syrians from the Golan Heights. Control of Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank now belong to the rogue colonial settler state that we all call Israel. They then control roughly 78% of all historic Palestine. The Shaham Plan was now to be enacted, and military dictatorship was to be the fate of the Palestinians. They used those powers to arrest and detain people with no trial or due process, close any business, workplace, or school they wanted for any reason or no reason whatsoever, impose curfews on whim alone with the power of life and death if the curfew was violated. Complete and total military dictatorship for the non-Israelis. Part of this plan also included two notable features. 1. Never grant citizenship to any Palestinian in an occupied territory. And 2. Never give up control of the West Bank and Gaza. The second of these has interesting ramifications. If you consider any time the Israelis have been willing to participate in peace talks, this is a position that is affirmed to this very day by the Israeli government. They have never been acting in good faith at any negotiations for peace. Begin the era of finger-wagging. Fun fact, in 1963, a little-known group who I'm sure you have never heard of was incorporated in the USA. Let me just check my notes here. AIPAC. Yeah, I think that's right. AIPAC. Apparently it stands for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. We'll circle back around to them maybe, but for now, just know that they built upon a foundation of some of the earliest and most powerful lobbying the world has ever seen, and to this day control policies the world over through their targeted funding and defunding of politicians. They essentially buy every politician, and if the politician doesn't cooperate, they target them and fund the opposition. They helped, along with Benjamin Netanyahu, drag America into countless quagmires at this point, including Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So, what does the U.S. do after the Six-Day War? They've condemned Israeli actions in the past, they've threatened to step in before, and now they've just had their soldiers killed and one of their boats sank. And any student of American history knows what happens when you touch the boats. Well, since it's Israel and post-AIPAC, nothing. Nothing substantive, at least. Investigations into the USS Liberty incident will be had. No conclusions will be made, and the birth of the official U.S. policy that carries through to this very day is born. History began in the year of our Lord, 1967, that Israel did nothing wrong and was merely defending themselves, and any concession of territory they may even offer to make is a sign of generosity. Continue the cuckery. During the Nixon administration, his Secretary of State, William Rogers, tried to get Israel to withdraw from Egyptian-occupied territories. Ignoring the whole Palestinian issue, of course. But enter good old Henry fucking hopefully he's getting sodomized by Satan Kissinger. That plan was dead in the water. Kissinger, after all, had no use for the Palestinians as he saw them as being in league with the Soviets and Arab regimes. They were either to be removed or simply ignored, though he was a pragmatist and did conduct secret talks with the PLO that enabled U.S. back channels to secure the U.S. Beirut embassy and American citizens with PLO assistance during the Lebanese Civil War. Fast forward to October 1973 when Egypt and Syria attack Israel in order to recapture the Golan Heights. Israel manages to repel this attack with, you guessed it, U.S. assistance. This little dust-up has the moniker of the Yom Kippur War and resulted in the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty. In 1975, the ANC, the African National Congress, coming from the African point of view of decolonization, saw the PLO and the Palestinians as one cause and were able to get past UN Resolution 3379, in which it was, quote, determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. This resolution stood until 1991 when a U.S.-led attempt to revoke it succeeded. The sad fact of the matter is that Western nations, but especially the United States, have been the target of and generally infiltrated by Israeli assets and operations for decades now. Between entities such as AIPAC, which actively control our political sphere, and the Israeli military, who does the most what is called adversarial collection on U.S. officers, diplomatic personnel, and an intelligence apparatus, more than even China and Russia, or at least according to the Foreign Area Officers Course, which educates officers on becoming regional experts, so it would appear the U.S. military feels so as well. A series of blunders. While the PLO gained legitimacy globally, especially in Europe, it maintained a dual method approach. Absolutely willing to negotiate and come to the table, but simultaneously maintaining its guerrilla operations. Unfortunately, in these intervening years, they had poorly planned, poorly executed operations that served to undermine their gained legitimacy and the cause in others' eyes. Now, don't misunderstand me for 1 second here. In a war that was as twisted and devious as this one is, with so many civilian casualties, I'm not about to enter the war crimes competition and start wringing my hands over these events. But I do find, but I do interpret them from an analytical point of view and understand how they were perceived, and not only perceived, but used by the media and the machinations that produce and weave the narratives sold to the public to manufacture consent. One of the first that occurred was the kidnapping of the Israeli delegation to the Munich Olympics by a militant group named Black September. Lousy guerrilla faction. Solid band name, though. 11 of the delegation are killed in a bungled attempt to rescue them by the German police. This caused the Israelis to go on an assassination spree that once again ignored the sovereignty of multiple nations. Israel has a habit of simply ignoring others' boundaries while complaining and murdering over theirs. Authorized by the Israeli version of Margaret Thatcher, a right-wing cunt of a human being, Golda Meir, the Israelis executed Operation Wrath of God and began killing PLO leaders across Europe and the Middle East. Fun fact about this little extrajudicial spec ops spree, a team of Mossad agents murdered an innocent waiter in Lillehammer, Norway, because they relied on bad intel and didn't bother doing their own. This wasn't the only fuck-up, of course, but because Israelis have never given a shit about civilian casualties, no matter whose they are. Another such example of their fine work was when they sought to assassinate Ali Hassan Salameh, who was located in Germany at the time, and their brilliant covert plan to kill him was pack his Volkswagen full of explosives and blow him and everyone in it with him up. They failed 5 times before they managed to actually kill the guy. Oh, they also killed 4 bystanders, including a student and a nun. This was the contact that Kissinger used to back-channel to the PLO, by the way. Yeah, Israelis hold a grudge like no one else. So yes, the Arab guerrilla operations over the years have harmed civilians, absolutely. But they have always harmed far less, and done so with less abandon and impunity, whereas the Israeli forces sneak into any country they feel like, kill with reckless abandon, murder civilians, and disappear into the night after doing so, and if on some off chance a few of them get caught, as was the case in Lillehammer, they're released from prison shortly thereafter due to pressure from Zionist lobbies and the Israeli government. You want another of this tit for tat behavior that's always completely disproportionate and usually just an excuse for expansionism? Fine. How about in 1978 when Fatah hijacked a bus from Haifa headed to Tel Aviv? 37 civilians were killed in this hijacking. Israel's response? Hunt down the perpetrators? No. Invade southern Lebanon and attempt to occupy it. Granted, there was a logic to this. The PLO had operations there for some time now and were known to train guerrilla operators there, but Israel wasn't after that. They were doing the old land grab again, now occupying territory up to the river Litani. They then got involved in the Lebanese civil war, attempting to empower the side that was counter to the side that was friendly with the PLO. Unfortunately for Israel, in the long term, the Amal, Hezbollah's predecessor, ended up controlling that portion of Lebanon, though it would take years and American intervention to negotiate a truce. Israel violated that truce within months. Menahem Begin. Welcome back to the stage, everyone. Ariel Sharon. Fresh off his tour of committing atrocities, he, like so many before him, really started to get into politics. He was appointed to the position of Minister of Defense by the new right-wing government led by Menahem Begin, and boy, did they have one thing in common for sure: the Greater Israel Project. In 1977, he helped bolster a new right-wing political bloc, the Likud Party, which really only had one thing they advocated for: Greater Israel. starting with the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza and the removal of Palestinians from them. They couldn't have picked a better guy, as even after committing various war crimes, he was responsible for a huge surge in settlement expansion in the West Bank already, so he was a nice fit for the role. It was an eager beaver to get to work. First things first. He replaced that military rule with civil administration for the West Bank and Gaza in 1981. Sounds better, right? Yeah, no. What it really did was create a quasi-Israeli government in the occupied territories that made people's lives even worse. The military didn't go away, they just had another bureaucracy that ensnared the Palestinians in its web. Now you could add non-stop bureaucratic harassment to the pile of shit the Palestinians had to contend with every moment of their existence. No moving around, no having a job, no higher education, requiring permits to go to the hospital, and of course these permits would need to be verified and inspected, and for that we have checkpoints. Oh, so many checkpoints. Checkpoints galore at which the Palestinian people could look forward to Israeli soldiers abusing them, bullying them, persecuting them, extorting them, trying to turn them into collaborators, just as a matter of everyday policy. Want to see your sick grandmother at the hospital? Name names. Try and resist any of this, even non-violently, such as Lajnat al-Tawij or the Committee of Guidance did, and well, your organization is de facto illegal, and all your leaders will be arrested by the army, who will allow Jewish settlers to attack you, and if you defend yourself, then they will open fire. But why stop there? Ritual humiliation, psychological torture, and military dictatorship not enough for you? Well, it certainly wasn't enough for Ariel Sharon. Let's do a little attempt at manufacturing consent and controlled opposition while we're at it. And so the Village League was established as an alternative to Palestinian leadership. There's a problem, though. The PLO still exists, and people seem to be attached to it for some reason. Nothing to do with that whole demanding return of refugees to their lands thing, I'm sure. Thus, Sharon sought to eliminate the PLO influence. One problem, though. The PLO has a headquarters and training camp across the border in Lebanon. Uh-oh, what's our scrappy little guy to do? You guessed it! Take the actions of something and someone else entirely unrelated to Lebanon and separate from the PLO, conflate them, and invade Lebanon in an attempt to topple their government and install an Israeli-friendly one. Of course! On June 4th, 1982, a group called Abu Nidal, whose founder had left the PLO years prior and started a different organization, the ANO, attempted to assassinate the Israeli ambassador in London. So, obviously, the only option was to wholesale invade Lebanon and occupy it, including capturing the capital of Beirut. Assisted by the right-wing Maronite militia, they're Christians, by the way, who were planning on being on the receiving end of more power from Sharon, which he followed through with, and a solid chap by the name of Bashir Gemayel was elected for a hot minute from their ranks. Of course, as is tradition with this sort of thing, once this right-wing group of religious extremists were in power, they began to massacre thousands of Palestinian refugees in camps in September of that year. Massacres in Shabra and Shatia were both investigated by UN Commission and the IDF themselves, with both finding that the IDF knew what was going to happen, that they did not act. In fact, they aided the perpetrators. The UN deemed the massacres genocide. In the backdrop of this was nonstop, wholesale, widespread bombings conducted by Israel that eventually led the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, to surrender, and the PLO officially moved from to Tunis, with the Israeli army now receding back to southern Lebanon. Israel was about to discover they had a new problem, though, trying to occupy southern Lebanon. Hezbollah, a Shia Muslim militant faction that was more than happy to conduct decades-long guerrilla wars to kick Israel out. It would take 28 years, but they would succeed. Knut warned them. The tides cannot be stopped. The Israelis would do well to heed the words of King Knut, but they tend not to listen to sage advice, but only to their colonial greed. After decades of military and administrative rule by the occupying forces, the Palestinians were reaching a point of criticality, and it wouldn't take much to cause an eruption. December 8th, 1987, An Israeli truck collides with a car full of Palestinian civilian workers, killing all 4 Palestinians. The fuse had been lit, and nonviolent protests erupted across the Jabalia refugee camp. Protests that have now come to be known as the First Intifada, or uprising in Arabic. The protests quickly and spontaneously spread across the occupied territories, with Gaza becoming the crucible in which much of the coming forms of resistance would be forged. Characterized by distributed, localized organizational networks that sprung up in cities, refugee camps, and villages that emerged from a bottom-up strategy. Newly minted activists of all walks of life, men, women, professionals, farmers, urban poor, rural villagers, students, and shopkeepers. Women, in fact, took a key role in the groups, as the Israelis would target men specifically for jail, or worse. Thus, women would perform the role of organizer. The mission was simple: nonviolent demonstrations and self-sustainability. The Palestinian people wanted their right to self-determination, and simply to exist on the land they had long inhabited. Alongside demonstrations, they deployed traditional tactics such as boycotts, strikes, withholding taxes, and while the protests almost always started as nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations of popular sentiment, they would quickly and inevitably turn violent, as the so-called Israelis would inflict heavy casualties using so-called rubber bullets and live ammunition on unarmed demonstrators or kids throwing rocks. The occupiers would tolerate this affront for a month before Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin would order the Israeli security forces to use, quote, force, might, and beatings, and to, quote, break their bones, referring directly to protesters, a legacy of tactic of inflicting intentional disability on those that stand up to their oppression that continues to this day. The thugs would break the arms, legs, and skulls of demonstrators, mostly young people, often children, the youngest generations having now been raised knowing nothing but Israeli dictatorship and colonial apartheid rule. For a little over 8 years, the First Intifada raged on, leaving 1,600 people dead, 12% of them Israeli. The PLO didn't understand. There's a few things to note here about how the First Intifada's relative success in unifying the Palestinian people and showing the world once again the brutality of Israel actually contained the elements of turmoil to come. First off, the grassroots local movement that superseded the traditional leadership came as a direct challenge to their power, and with the PLO in Tunis having been relatively out of touch and stuck in a state of impotence, this sudden success of a ground-up movement caught them off guard, but they lost no time in attempting to co-opt and use it for their own benefit. A group of would-be leaders who hadn't been inside Palestine for decades and certainly did not understand the politics on the ground now sought to take advantage of a dynamic, people-driven movement. Now attempting to direct the movement from a distance, ignoring the knowledge and wishes of those with boots on the ground and skin in the game, they quickly were squandering any advantage that was had. This situation worsened when Abu Jihad, Arafat's closest lieutenant and a leading figure in Fatah, who had long dealt with the occupied territories, was assassinated in April of 1988. In this vacuum of expertise, many poor decisions to come would be made. Do you condemn hummus? The First Intifada gave birth to the now infamous Hamas, founded by Ahmed Yassin the same year, springing from the roots of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood that had been present in Gaza since the 1950s, an acronym for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or simply Islamic Resistance. Fun fact, Hamas was supported and funded by Israel in an attempt to disempower and counter the PLO. We'll come back to these guys in a bit. More things that the PLO didn't understand. The United States. The PLO leadership never sought to better understand the United States or how it goes about its modes of diplomacy. They saw U.S. presidents and industry titans meeting with Arab monarchs as some sort of pro-Arab sentiment. They also never engaged with public opinion. As a result, they were blind to the actual prevailing feelings and never chose to engage in an all-out propaganda and media blitz like the Israelis had long been doing. This would lead them to never quite getting the sympathies of the public, as well as being led down a garden path at the Madrid conference, which ended in abject failure, and the Oslo conference, which ended with the PLO getting worked over, blindsided, and signing an agreement that gave away 40% of the West Bank formally to the Israelis, and created the Palestinian Authority, an organization that is required to collaborate with the Israeli army and secret services in order to monitor and suppress any resistance forces in the territory. The PLO transformed from a once righteous resistance to a bought and paid for snitch. The only other thing to note from the Oslo conference is the two-timing by leftist groups. When seeking someone to engage negotiations through, Israel used their Labour Party ties with the Norwegian trade unions and settled on FAFO, a Norwegian trade union organization, to be the mediator. FAFO had a very particular theory of conflict management that was popular in the West, one that looked upon conflict resolution in terms of power imbalances. Now, those that are familiar with my works in advocacy may be thinking that's a good thing. Hold on. They used those tools of analysis to identify who held the dominant position of power in a situation, and then went about their role to get what they saw as the best deal from them, and then proceeded to pressure the weaker side to simply accept it, given that they believed whatever was offered was better than what they had, so they should simply take it and be grateful. So when all was said and done, due to the PLO's backstabbing and two-timing and general ignorance of the original resistance leaders, and the groups rejected the Oslo I Accord, as did the political Islamist groups such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Who did join? The left-wing groups. This was a fundamental turning point in the nature of Palestinian resistance, and why the once largely secular movement became dominated by Islamic militants as it is today, because the secular left-wing groups sold out to the West. Oslo II. The first Oslo Accord, while it did some concrete things, was mostly just vibes, really, and so it had to be translated into something substantive. Enter the Second Oslo Accord, signed near the border of Egypt and Israel in September of 1995. Arafat, with what small dignity he may have had left, saw it wrenched from him by the Egyptian president, who literally pushed him forward to sign it. Welcome to Area A, B, and C. The new areas created in the Accord were new designations for the last bit of occupied territory. Area A comprised of no more than 18% of the West Bank, and included the most densely populated part, and was supposedly an autonomous zone in which the Palestinian Authority had control, but it was obvious that this was not true due to the nature of the apartheid and military control Israel exerted. Area B was supposed to be a shared authority zone with the Palestinian Authority and Israel controlling over it, but again, it was obvious to all that Israel was the ruler of it. Area C was designated for Jewish settlements and would be off-limit to Palestinians. The Gaza Strip, an Israeli invention, was left undefined but was supposed to be run similarly to Area B. The refugees weren't mentioned, and the Israelis patronizingly said they'd consider thinking about discussing Jerusalem and settlements in the future as a reward for, and I quote, good behavior from the Palestinians. It's never fucking enough. The right wing of Israel never wanted the Oslo Accords signed in the first place, as any Palestinian on their land was always going to be an affront to their European colonial settler sensibilities. The savages had to go, and so when in November of 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by an extreme right-wing Jewish terrorist, I might add, the country's politics started their slide even further to the right. Enter Bibi! Benjamin Netanyahu, leader of the right-wing Likud party, makes his debut as the newly elected Prime Minister of Israel. This man is a master of saying one thing and doing another, all the while making the West dance to his tune. This man would make it his mission to torture the Palestinian people with his ever increasingly oppressive measures while making fools of Western leaders who would almost all, one by one, become party to, or at the very least complicit, in the silence about the apartheid and genocide of the Palestinian people. More checkpoints. No, seriously, a lot more. Hundreds more checkpoints were to be built between areas A, B, and C. Not just between the areas that theoretically the Palestinians should be able to move freely about, but also more checkpoints between the north and south of Gaza, and not to mention between occupied territories and Israel. Sites of blatant, systematic degradation, humiliation, and dehumanization of Palestinians, these checkpoints served as a place for Israeli soldiers to violate the most basic of human rights for no reason whatsoever. Unable to cross, many gave birth by the checkpoint, as just as many died, both unable to reach a hospital due to the sadistic whims of a soldier. It's officially a prison now. In 1996, the Netanyahu administration erected a barbed wire fence entirely around Gaza. If South Africa says it, look, let's be real. Some people and places have knowledge of the sin. It's like when a domestic abuser tells you you're being mean to your spouse. Time to check yourself. Well, when South Africa calls it apartheid, yeah, it's apartheid. But for the sake of argument, let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Using what we know now about the practices in place, let's look at what apartheid is and if it's appropriate to call Israel an apartheid state. Apartheid is best qualified as, quote, a system of institutional segregation and discrimination. Well, let's now have a gander back at Israel. There is a near total separation between the Palestinian and Israeli populations. There are separate judicial systems for Palestinian and Israeli populations. Palestinian population has a judicial system that provides them functionally no rights and acts without any modern sense of judicial propriety or fairness. The Israeli population has a judicial system that protects their civil liberties and recognizes their fundamental human rights. Controls on movements applied to Palestinians and not Israelis. See sterile roads that Palestinians are not allowed on under threat of death and checkpoints solely for Palestinians. Continued expropriation of property and land under military enforcement with no recourse. Military enforced limitations on access to information. Any publications in Arabic grammar banned by military order. Access to water is restricted, including no new wells and even collection of rainwater. Military permission is required for Palestinians to withdraw funds from their bank accounts. So, the long and short of it is, Israel is an apartheid state, but don't take my word for it either. Here's some groups that think it is. The UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine in a report to the ICJ. The Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa. Report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia report. Yesh Din of Israel. B'Tselem of Israel. International Federation for Human Rights. Human Rights Watch. Amnesty International. International Commission of Jurists. Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories report to UN Human Rights Council. Special Committee to investigate the Israeli practices affecting the human rights of Palestinian people report. United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territories report. Uprising 2, Year 2000 Boogaloo. In the intervening years, our little upstart group, Hamas, has been gaining in popularity. In fact, as the PLO faded into obscurity, though its face was still worn like a skinned murder victim by the Palestinian Authority, it seemed Hamas just got more and more popular. As an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Israelis gave them a certain amount of leeway, actually, mainly because they continued to see them as useful tools in order to divide the populace and undermine the Palestinian Authority. Though their main growth was due to a regional trend that was a reactionary force to the perceived bankruptcy of secularism that had been the prevailing political mode throughout the Middle East for much of the 20th century. As the PLO and then the PA shifted away from armed resistance and became even more impotent in their abilities, seemed to be signing deals that simply gave away more and more of the Palestinians' rights and lands, organizations like Hamas, who were consistent in their ideology and fervor, started to become increasingly attractive options. Ariel Sharon wants to be PM. After a disastrous summit at Camp David between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, presided over by now lame duck President Clinton, Ariel Sharon, leader of the Likud party, sought to make moves. Due to escalating tensions in and around Jerusalem, due to settler expansionism, destruction of entire neighborhoods, Israeli tunneling projects that ruined much of the old city, and a history going back decades of this being an area of great contention, everyone was on edge already. So Sharon decides to visit Temple Mount and declare that, quote, "The Temple Mount is in our hands and will remain in our hands." The Palestinians protested this declaration of annexation. Consider the fuse lit. The Israeli military went to town. During the first few days of protests, they used 1.3 million rounds of ammunition against unarmed demonstrators, and after 13 Palestinian protesters who were actual citizens of Israel were shot dead by Israeli military forces, all bets were off. Palestinians took up arms and explosives. You see, this wasn't like the first Intifada. This one was far more militant and violent in its nature, resulting in the worst surge of violence since 1967. After the Israelis showed their brutality once again, happily demonstrating that they were willing to escalate beyond imagination, there was but one response left. Hamas and its lesser partner, the Islamic Jihad, began a campaign of assaults and suicide bombings, targeting vulnerable civilian locations, just as the Israelis had always done. They targeted mainly buses, cafes, and shopping centers inside Israel. For once, the violence that had been largely concentrated in their neighborhoods now found perch in the Israeli city centers and towns in which the Israeli military had no defenses planned or set up. By the end of 2001, Fatah had also joined in on the campaign, resulting in a bevy of attacks against the occupying colonizers on their own turf. The breakdown was such. Approximately 46% of the bombings were Hamas, 26% by Islamic Jihad, and 26% by Fatah, with the remaining 8% by various groups technically within the PLO. The deadliest attack was conducted by Hamas, the bombing of the Park Hotel in Netanyahu during a Passover celebration, in which 30 were killed and 140 were wounded. Israel gonna Israel now. There's no way that such a campaign of violence wouldn't be responded to, and so Israel began Operation Defensive Shield that reoccupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, ratcheting down the collective punishment even further. By deploying their air force, they could destroy entire sections, killing mass amounts of civilians with ease. They massacred people in the Jenin refugee camp, maintaining this campaign of domination for years. They also confined Arafat in his compound until he mysteriously fell ill, likely of poisoning. His replacement, Mahmoud Abbas, was more cautious and sought to strengthen ties between the Palestinian Authority and its Israeli intelligence handlers, like a good little lapdog. When all was said and done, over the 8-year campaign of the Second Intifada and the resulting Israeli operations, 6,600 people were killed, 70% Israeli. It can always get worse. In the subsequent years, Israel kept tightening the noose, strangling Palestinians more and more. Enter the Knesset, the Israeli legislative body that sought to bury Palestinians even further under a ruthless, uncaring bureaucracy. Let's look at a couple of examples of laws they passed. How about the nationality and entry into Israel law that they passed in 2003? This little doozy prohibited anyone from the West Bank or Gaza from being granted citizenship or residency permits through marriage to an Israeli citizen. There was the 2011 Nakba law that would defund any institution that recognized or commemorated the Nakba. Or how about the Jewish nation state basic law passed in 2018, which downgraded Arabic as a language, claimed Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, threw in a host of new settlement expansions, just for spite, I'm sure, and gave priority citizenship to emigre Jews. No one else, just them. Get fucked, Gentiles. More laws still were passed to enshrine the rights of Jewish towns and resident areas to actively discriminate by not even permitting Palestinian entry if they so wished. This process of Judaization and de-Arabization continues unchecked all across the region, from the Bedouins of Naqab, who were pushed from their land and then they had their very way of life, agriculture and animal grazing, made illegal, resulting in them attempting to settle down and built villages which Israel systematically demolished as they didn't receive state approval to do so. 97% of all Palestine is now owned or directly or indirectly by Jewish institutions, such as the Jewish Nation Fund, whose very charter states they disallow transactions with, and I quote, non-Jews. Palestinians are barred from buying lands. They cannot build or develop existing towns or villages, let alone new ones, but anyone who happens to be Jewish can move unmolested to Israel, get fast-track citizenship, and simply take some Palestinian land if they'd like. It's all perfectly legal. The election. After the death of Arafat, the new leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, had a very tenuous hold on things and feared that if elections were held nationwide, that Hamas may gain ground over the controlled opposition within the PA. And given how they performed in local elections, that seemed likely. Sharon, that scheming fuck. Seeing an opportunity for a play, Sharon offered to disengage in the Gaza Strip, removing 8,000 settlers that were there, and relinquish any responsibility for administration of the territory. What he sought to do was fully realize the potential of Gaza as a prison once and for all, a means to contain Hamas and other Palestinian undesirables within the defensible walls that were now constructed around Gaza in its entirety, allowing for Israel to simply attack inwardly as they saw fit. With the rabid settler movement fighting Sharon tooth and nail, the hardened perpetrator of multiple atrocities was unfazed in his plans and removed the settlers as promised. Though excited by the prospect of self-governance, the Palestinians of Gaza were now left with a power vacuum as far as governance was concerned, and Hamas seemed ready to fill it. In stepped the quartet, the EU, the US, Russia, and the UN, to try and prevent Hamas from coming to power. They encouraged the Palestinian Authority to quickly hold elections, aware of the obvious fact that their lapdog Abbas had no counterpart to rival his campaign. Elections were held in 2006, and Hamas won 44% of the vote, which, by the PA's own laws, allowed their majority to form the government, with Ismaili Haniyeh leading them. The US and Israel refused to recognize the new government and began immediately encouraging others not to as well. Israel starts arresting Hamas leadership. Hamas kidnaps a soldier who gets held captive for 5 years. It's a whole thing. And with Israel and the West refusing to acknowledge their authority, Hamas decided to take the Gaza Strip by force, actually fighting against other militant groups such as Fatah in the process. Israel can't take Lebanon. So while the elections are being held and Hamas is coming to power, Israel and Lebanon are at it again. Hezbollah captured 3 Israeli soldiers, who they stated were in Lebanese territory illegally. Israel, of course, opened diplomatic channels and began negotiations by invading Lebanon again. Israel, always the bastion of sanity and proportionate attacks, literally destroyed all of South Beirut, the capital and largest and capital city of Lebanon, destroying thousands of buildings. Hezbollah began rocket attacks into the north of Israel. A little aside here, in the city of Beirut was someone important watching the Israeli bombers destroying tower blocks during this war. His name was Osama bin Laden, and he stated that he received his inspiration for the attack on September 11th that day. Anyway, the war lasted 34 days before UN Resolution 1701 was passed, in which Israel promised to withdraw from Lebanon, since it now was occupying it again, and Hezbollah promised to withdraw to north of the river Litani. Neither side did what they promised, and the UN was super useful in enforcing the resolution, as always. Luckily, Ariel Sharon had suffered a stroke in 2006 as well, and Ehud Olmert took power and was slightly more relaxed and willing to trade some territory for territory. However, we won't know how that would have turned out because Olmert had to resign and due to some minor bribery and corruption. Don't worry, he was totally innocent, just like all the other guys in jail with him. He's back. The return of Bibi and the Likud party, baby. What were they about again? Oh yeah, fuck all these Arabs. It's all our land, and if they don't like it, they can just die. So he got back to the program of unilateral expansionism while simultaneously tightening restrictions even further on Gaza. Hope and change. Thanks, Obama. Yeah, a couple of rounds of talks in 2010 and 2012 came back with a grand total of bupkis for the Palestinians and just allowed Israeli settlers to further their never-ending land grab program, while the Palestinians were continually oppressed. In the West Bank, settlers engaged regularly in behavior such as burning houses and fields, uprooting trees, attacking Palestinians, all the classic hits at this point, while the Israeli army stands by and watches, and if the Palestinians dare defend themselves, well, machine guns go burr. During this period, East Jerusalem came under further Judaization with the help of American far-right Christian and Jewish organizations, further ethnically cleansing entire neighborhoods once more. When the devil makes a deal with another devil, Netanyahu functionally lost the March 2021 legislative snap election when a coalition of centrist, relatively moderate settler parties and a couple of smaller right-wing parties and even the Islamist Ra'am party were able to gain a majority and form a government, though it was incredibly short-lived, and he regained control in November of 2022. The main issue here is who he needed to align to gain that majority back. The Otzma Yehudit, aka the Jewish Power Party, which is exactly as racist as you think it sounds, and the Haidite, the religious Zionism party. They joined forces and began to fill out the ranks of some of the more important ministerial positions, such as the Minister of National Security, which was filled out by one Itamar Ben-Gvir, or the Minister of Finance, who was one Bezalel Smotrich. Yeah. The incoming crew were all disciples and graduates of the Messianic settler movement that helped colonize the West Bank in 1967, which gave form to a whole new generation of racist Jewish supremacist ideologues. Ben-Gvir was even convicted of incitement to racism in 2007. This is a group of hyper-religious racial supremacists who strive for a greater Israel unified as a theocratic state. First, they take the judiciary. The Israeli judiciary is no friend of Palestinian people, nor is it really a friend of anyone who isn't Jewish or Israeli. But what could be said of it was that if you were secular LGBTQ+ or another Jewish minority living in Israel, it was often an ally. And when the new government initiated reforms in order to make the judiciary subservient to the right-wing forces within the new legislature, people did take to the streets. The protesters were not nobodies either. They were often comprised of economic elites and, by Israel conscription mandate, former soldiers. The encroachment of theocracy upon the secular nature of Israeli society was bringing Israel to the brink of civil war, but then the flood. We're finally here. It's been a long, winding journey to get to this point, but we're here. October 7th, 2023, the day of the Al-Aqsa flood. With an opening bombardment of an approximate 4,300 rockets, Hamas and other militants mounted on various vehicles, including the now infamous paragliders, raided Israeli territory, breaching the barrier with ease despite warnings from the Egyptians and their own border guards being issued to Israel up to 3 weeks earlier, as has been confirmed by Egypt and the head of the U.S. Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Michael McCaul. On the night of October 7th, Hamas conducted a coordinated attack that struck military bases and civilian targets alike. In total, 1,139 people were killed, 695 were Israeli civilians, 38 of those were children. 71 were foreign nationals. At least 14 were killed by Israel's Hannibal Directive, which states kidnappings must be stopped by any means necessary, including the killing of the hostage. And approximately 250 civilian and military hostages were taken. Now let's talk about what didn't occur, despite widespread media reporting. What didn't happen was the beheading of 40 babies, cooking babies alive, and the widespread rape of women and children. In fact, Israel's own special prosecutors for October 7th had been unable to produce any bit of admissible evidence of rape happening that day and could not prosecute anyone due to the complete lack of evidence. Multiple organizations, outlets, and groups have found that the Israeli claims from that day simply do not stand up to scrutiny. In fact, as I finish this piece, Israeli media outlet Ynet has published an exclusive story that details military documents that have been released that show that the Israeli military intelligence knew that some form of attack was likely imminent and allowed the now infamous Nova Music Festival to go forward despite multiple credible warnings. Yes, there were war crimes. Absolutely, with no doubt about it. On that day, Hamas and other militant groups committed various war crimes and have been and rightfully should be condemned for them, including by the ICJ. But just hear me out for a second. Yes, they absolutely committed horrific acts that any sane and well-adjusted person couldn't bring themselves to do. But they aren't well-adjusted, are they? They're contending with a situation the likes of which you now have some beginning of an understanding of. They have been invaded, displaced, beaten, humiliated, tortured, raped, and murdered for generations now. What do you really think those conditions create? They're conditions of desperation, of necessity, of last resort. That's what October 7th was. It was an act of last resort. Yahya Sinwar, the chairman of the Hamas Political Bureau, had two goals for the Al-Aqsa operation. One, make it more costly for Israel to oppress Palestine. Two, remind the world that Palestine's still there and being oppressed. With neither reverence nor condemnation, one can assess those goals and come to the conclusion that they were successful. At a cost? Absolutely. But those events did not occur in a vacuum. The Hamas fighters didn't magically appear from another dimension. The fighters who breached those Israeli barriers, those walls of apartheid, that day were young men who learned the way of violence from Israeli bullets and bombs. A lifetime spent in a cage, dehumanized, tortured, and so with no other options left to them, they chose violence. Yes, it's all a genocide. Frankly, in my opinion, it's one giant, protracted genocide with a ton of genocide spread throughout it. The Nakba was a genocide, and what Israel did after the events of October 7th has certainly been genocide. It has been the first live-stream genocide in history, shown for all to see on their internet-connected devices. The intent is there. They've stated it time and time again on TV, in newspapers, and online for all to see. From the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, saying, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals and will act accordingly." To the Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, saying, "There are no half measures. Rafah, Deir al-Balah, Nusrat. Total annihilation. Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heaven. There is no place for them under heaven." Their intent is and has always been clear. The Israelis want the complete and total genocide of the Palestinian people in order to claim their land as their own. It doesn't matter if you experienced a genocide or if someone commits war crimes against your people. You don't get a free pass on genocide. And now Israel seemingly has gotten their hands on the genocide version of a Disney fast pass. Although some hold out hope that this time their pass may be revoked, only time will tell on that one. Here's what we know. And please understand, all of these numbers are gross underestimations, and history will almost assuredly show much higher figures when all is said and done. The Israeli actions following the events of October 7th have directly caused all of the following. 47,107 Palestinians confirmed dead as of January 2025 when I record this. Among them, 18,000 minors and 3,700 elderly. At least 111,147 injuries. 10,400 political prisoners or hostages. 3,376 of them held without any charge whatsoever. There are 9 out of 36 hospitals that remain with any sort of function in Gaza. They direct attacks on medical personnel. 260,000 people facing crisis level food insecurity. 1.1 million are facing catastrophic levels. 96% of women and children aged 6 to 23 months are not meeting daily nutritional requirements. 160,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women in need of nutritional supplements. Over 50,000 children estimated to need treatment for acute malnutrition. 95% of the population has no access to clean water. 7,000 unaccompanied or separated children. 273 aid workers and 151 journalists killed. At least 986 medical workers killed. 75,000 plus tons of explosives dropped on Gaza. 87% of educational institutions destroyed and over 750 teachers and educational staff killed. 206 recognized archaeological and heritage sites destroyed. 3 Christian churches destroyed, including some of the oldest in the world, including one where over 500 people were sheltering. They have conducted airstrikes on designated refugee zones at least 97 times and confirmed reports, firsthand testimony, and extensive documented accounts of widespread, systematic rape of men, women, and children in Israeli detention, including the use of inanimate objects and dogs, often resulting in grave injury. Is there hope? Yes. I'm not alone in that sentiment either. And I'd argue it's certainly not with merit. Israel, in exposing themselves in the way they have during this last round of atrocities, has begun a process of their demise. It's death by 1,000 cuts. They devastated their own economy year on year now. They destroyed 100,000 plus small and medium businesses. They caused global capital to flee. Their southern port went into bankruptcy. They opened up wars on multiple fronts, ensuring no peace will come even as they side in their fraud of a ceasefire with Hamas. They exacerbated their internal political conflicts and continue to wage war on all fronts, now reinvigorating their efforts to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in the West Bank as I type this. In short, they overplayed their hand. And you can see the fascist Western forces doing their best to authoritarian away the image problems they're having now. Word is out. Israel is a pariah state on the global stage, and finally citizens of the Western powers are waking up to their role in generations-long genocidal colonial settler project with its roots in hate and greed. In the words of Ilan Pappé, who without his amazing lifelong work in this field, this peace simply could not exist. This isn't the beginning of the worst chapter in the Palestinian story, but the end of the worst chapter. It has been an honor. It has been an honor for me to assemble this piece. As a lifelong anarchist, I can simply say to the Palestinian people and all oppressed and marginalized people everywhere, continue to fight. Until we're free, if any one of us remains in chains, we all remain in chains. I hope this essay on steroids, this educational attempt, has been of some use, some interest, has given you more understanding into a conflict that seems so impenetrable and opaque that few even bother to try and understand it. And if you do wish to go deeper and understand more, please consider reading the following authors: Ali Ibn Amah, Diana Allen, Jeffrey Lewis, Ilan Pappé, Nir Masala, Patrick Wolf, Rashid Khalidi, and so many others.